Hey everyone, it's Tristan, historian and host of the Ancients podcast, also now on YouTube. Now everyone is absolutely obsessed with the Odyssey at the moment, so we thought we would compile some of our most popular videos on ancient Greek myths and warfare. We've got a brand new documentary in there on the Greek myth of Medusa. We've got Roel Konijnendijk, Dr. Ditch, answering Google questions on ancient Greek warfare, as well as some fantastic debates with all of your favourite historians and hosts. So, without further ado, let's jump into it.
"2,600 years ago, this place, a temple of Artemis on Corfu, had a connection with a myth that has endured ever since. Medusa.
You've heard of her snaky hair and stony gaze, and you may think you know her story. A young hero sent on a quest to behead the terrifying, sometimes grotesque, sometimes beautiful Gorgon. But do you really know the complexity and the tragedy of her tale? Come with me to meet the real Medusa. Let's start at the very beginning. The first literary account we know of Medusa is thanks to the poet Hesiod. The Gorgons dwell beyond glorious ocean, in the frontier land towards night. They are the immortal Stheno and Euryale who grow not old, and their mortal sister Medusa, who suffered a woeful fate. On the beautiful island of Corfu, it's a story literally written in stone.
Just over a century ago, farmers were digging here, next to the convent of Ios Theodorus. And then they found some stone figures.
The farmers didn't know what they had unearthed in this quiet corner of Corfu, but the Greek Archaeological Society began to excavate. Little by little, they revealed the remains of an ancient temple to Artemis built 2,600 years ago. The scale was enormous. As the team continued digging through the spring of 1911, they discovered a huge, sculpted pediment. Staying nearby was the German Kaiser. He came to have a look and arrived to see a face emerge from the ground. The face of a Gorgon. I've come to meet her now, in Corfu's marvellous Museum of Archaeology.
So this is the Temple of Artemis pediment, which was found by those farmers just across the island in Corfu. And this is Medusa, not just a Gorgon, but the Gorgon, the most famous of the three sisters. That's the pediment of the Temple of Artemis. And you can see Medusa exactly as she's been described to us in our literary sources. You can see that she has snakes in her hair. Not snakes instead of hair, that's a later innovation, but you can see she's got snakes coming out around her ringlets, and she's also got snakes right up along her hairline, just little tiny chic ones. Obviously she also has this incredible belt made of double snakes, which makes her look super powerful. The other thing about Gorgons that people often don't know is that they have wings, so she can fly. And you can see that because you can just see a few of the feathers behind her left arm. And while we're up there, would you just look at the incredible bicep that she has? This is a strong Gorgon. This is not a sort of little girly one. That she is tough, right? And you can see how strong she is, because you can see the muscle definition across her. So she's got those very, very strong biceps. She's got really strong buttocks. And you can see how incredibly muscled her legs are. because she's running, or more probably, she's flying. This is how this pinwheeling leg movement that makes her look to us like a runner, when matched with wings in ancient art, probably means that she's flying. So she's moving at speed.
Before Hesiod composed the story of Medusa in the 7th century BCE, Gorgonaea, or Gorgon heads, had already appeared in the Odyssey and the Iliad as a phantom in Hades and as a terrifying head on the shield of the Greek warrior Agamemnon. But Corfu's Medusa, carved 2,600 years ago, gives us the full, whole-body package.
So Gorgons have a wide mouth and a protruding tongue. And again, this is something that we see in almost all Gorgonaea, Gorgon heads, and then in Gorgons later on, there's the possibility of noise. There are lots of different attempts to derive the word Gorgo, Gorgon in English, and none of them is completely spot on probably, but one of the more plausible arguments is that it comes from the noise of thunder. So perhaps she can make this very loud noise. Gorgons are often associated with a cacophonous noise, which is why I think often ancient male authors are a bit unnerved by them. Women making a loud noise is always alarming.
Medusa is one of 3 sisters. They are the daughters of the primordial sea god, Phorcys, and his wife, Cato, who produce a tremendous array of sea monster offspring. The Gorgons Stheno and Euryale are immortal, but strangely, the 3rd sister, Medusa, is not.
So the reason that we know that this is Medusa rather than one of her Gorgon sisters is her offspring. It's one of the things that we often forget in the modern world is that she has 2 children. It's a very unusual sculpture because generally in our ancient myths, they are born from her severed head at the point of her death. But on this occasion, as you can see, she's still bodily intact. So this is quite a rare example. But here are her offspring. You can see the back legs and the tail and the wing of Pegasus, the winged horse, who is born from Medusa's neck. And on the other side, this is Chrysaor. He's a golden giant. So you can see that he is big, not least because if we go in really close, you can perhaps just see his foot has survived. This sculpture is made of quite a soft stone, so it hasn't survived perhaps as sturdily as we might have hoped. But you can see that his foot is toe-to-toe with Medusa's gigantic foot. So even though he's a giant, he's not as big as her.
As well as telling the story of Medusa's offspring, this sculpture captures every detail of the mortal Gorgon herself.
Here you can see in close-up some of the beautiful design on the edge of her skirt. You can see her lovely ornate sandals, which have got these gorgeous plant motifs. And you can also see, if we go in really close, you can see the scales on the snakes that make up her belt.
The Medusa of Corfu is not there to terrify the worshippers at the Temple of Artemis. Her job is to protect the temple. There is always this duality to Medusa in the Greek sources. She scares or she protects, depending on who you are. To help her achieve this, she has some fantastical wild beasts.
Look at her guardians, these leopanthers. A leopanther is a mythological creature, a cross between a lion and a panther. She's got a lovely leonine face and a mane, as you can see, which in its own way, by the way, just reminds us of Medusa's ringlets over there. And then a gorgeous tail hooking up over the back haunches. And the fur must be dappled or spotted. It has these beautiful little swirls on it to convey that it's not a completely even surface, but has got lovely little spots. So a leopanther.
The scale, detail, and beauty of Corfu's Medusa pediment takes my breath away. She dates from 580 BCE, from Greece's so-called Archaic period. I'm coming back to the site of the Temple of Artemis where it was discovered. You do have to use your imagination to picture the scene in the 6th century BCE. Luckily, help is at hand in the shape of local archaeologist Eleanor Janega.
So how big was this temple originally? I know it's not very grand now, but it's an incredibly important site, and that pediment was extraordinary.
Unfortunately, you don't have the opportunity to understand a lot of what it must have been during the Archaic period when it was discovered. It was a very, very big temple, the Temple of Artemis. Just have in mind that the measurements are almost 48 meters to 22.5 meters,
Wow.
and 14 meters in height. It was completely made of stone, apart from the roof.
So it was huge.
It was a very big building and one of the earliest examples of archaic architecture. The whole of the sanctuary is not preserved in good state, and this is because during 5th century after Christ, 3-nave basilica was built here using stones from the temple.
Right here in Corfu, 2,600 years ago, people built this Temple of Artemis, the oldest Greek stone temple we know of.
So what was Corfu like when this temple was built? I shouldn't say Corfu, should I? I should say Corcyra, because
Yes.
it was a Corinthian colony from the 8th century BC.
Yes,
Yeah.
and they become very, very prosperous through trade. They managed to have colonies in what is today the coastal area of northwestern Greece and also Albania.
Yep.
And we know that they are very wealthy because they are building this temple. A very early example of the Doric order, and a temple that is the first known example in ancient Greek architecture that was built using stone almost to its entirety.
Wow. So this was a huge display of wealth and power, which is why it overlooks the port.
Certainly, and having in mind that the Gorgon pediment is the western pediment, and anyone who would enter this port would be instantly informed of the wealth and the power of the city.
The Gorgon looked down on new arrivals in Corfu, both protecting and impressing above the entrance to the Temple of Artemis. And at the heart of that temple was this most enormous altar.
I feel like this is quite a stupid question, but I'm going to go for it anyway. Is this the actual altar of Artemis?
It is
down here?
certainly the altar, and you have to have in mind that this is part of that because the continuation to the south is actually underneath the monastery.
Oh, wow. So it would have gone right through where that wall now is. So it was massive.
It was a very large altar.
Yep.
And of course you have to have in mind that the temple was the place where the goddess was residing, but every form of cult was taking place around the altar.
Yes. So you need a really big altar for Artemis because, and this pains me as a vegetarian to say it, you're going to sacrifice lots of animals
Yes.
to Artemis.
She received bloody sacrifices.
She did.
mostly.
Artemis is a strange, wild goddess. She's part of the natural landscape, not agriculture, that's Demeter's province, but the trackless places where the wild things are. Woods, forests, the lands of animals untamed by humans. She is the Potnea Theron, the queen of wild creatures, so it's no surprise that Medusa and her wild beasts appeared above the entrance to her temple here. They are perfect partners.
this is her main attribute, that in such a good way we can see it in the Gorgon pediment here in Corfu, because as a Gorgon, she is surrounded by the Leo panthers, and in this way she is protecting the animals and protecting the whole community of live-ins, people, young life also.
As well as the Medusa-protected temple of Artemis, Corfu had several other shrines dedicated to the goddess and her wild ways. Worshippers have left us a scattering of figurines dedicated to her.
This Artemis, you can see right at the front, is looking after her. I'm pretty sure it's a deer. She's usually shown with deer, and it's got lovely deer legs, and it's sort of nuzzling up to her hand. So these votive figures would be made as offerings to the goddess, but they also are of the goddess. So this is quite a respectable looking Artemis by the standards of ancient depictions. And this one has got her bow, as you can see, in her hand, so she is going to go hunting. Artemis is a virginal goddess, one of 3 virginal goddesses in the big hitters of Mount Olympus, along with Athene and Hestia. She's the sister to Apollo. She is the daughter of Zeus. So Artemis is the goddess who looks after girls in their childhood. She's also, and you can never feel on too secure ground with Artemis, she's also the goddess who will suddenly take the life, which is what we're told happens in Iphigenia and Aulis, for example, the Euripides play, although, spoiler alert, she's swapped for a deer at the end, it's all okay. But she's not averse, therefore, to human sacrifice, so she protects girls, but she might also suddenly strike them down with her arrows. Artemis is the goddess of land, which is wild and pathless. So if you're going for a walk in the woods, it's Artemis who's your goddess of choice, and that's why she's armed with a bow and arrows. She's ready to get hunting.
And it's Medusa who is the protective partner of Artemis on Corfu. Part of the idea that Gorgons and their heads full of snakes and even tusks are a reminder of the protection we need from the wild world beyond. The Gorgon sisters occupy a liminal space. Their parents are sea creatures, they have wings, but they dwell on land. And the poet Hesiod gives us an idea of where we can find them. Beyond the Hesperides, the daughters of the evening, on the edge of the known world.
So Hesiod tells us that the Gorgons live, well, far away, essentially, further than the Hesperides even. And trying to find a real location for that is a bit of a challenge. People have generally assumed that he means somewhere like Libya, but maybe he means much further west. Our idea of what even Libya is different from Hesiod's. He hadn't been there, his audience hadn't been there, and I mean, the Gorgons might have been there, but Hesiod doesn't know that. So this is a fantastical imagining of perhaps the coast of North Africa as considered by a Greek who probably hasn't left the place where he started out. So we can kind of guess where the Gorgons might have gone. I like to think of them as being round about where the sun tends to set.
The Archaic period, when Hesiod first wrote Medusa's story, ran from 800 to 480 BCE. It was a time of immense change. City-states such as Athens, Corinth and Corcyra competed for power, and increasing trade led to colonization and a new age of intellectual exchange. Greek colonies stretched across Europe from what is now Spain to Russia, Egypt and Libya, expanding Greek culture, trade networks and influence throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. And it's when the first of what we'd recognise as Greek stone temples with columns were built, temples like Corfu's temple of Artemis. And this little late archaic gem at Kardaki.
So this is a Doric temple. It's from around 500 BCE. You can tell that the columns are Doric because they grow straight out of the ground like tree trunks, nothing fancy or decorative going on there. And then it broadens into an unadorned capital. So it doesn't have scrolls like an Ionian column would, doesn't have acanthus leaves, extra frills like a Corinthian column. The most famous temple in the world, I suppose, is probably the Parthenon, and that too has Doric columns. But generally, I feel like Doric temples are a little bit bigger than this. Some of this was lost in a landslide, but even so, it only took me a few seconds to walk from side to side, and it would take me a bit longer to go from side to side. One of the temples in Paestum, for example. So yeah, this is a sort of lovely, lost, quiet, hidden, tiny temple.
It was built in an extraordinary era of intellectual upheaval, including architecture, literature, and language, with the first recognisable Greek alphabet, as used by Hesiod for Medusa's story. To help me explore this unique moment, I'm meeting Tim Whitmarsh, Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge University.
Thank you for joining me amid the cicadas in Kardaki. Seems like the right place for it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful spot.
Tell me about our earliest literary source for Medusa. It's Hesiod, right?
It is Hesiod, yes. And calling it literary, of course, begs the question of what literature actually is. We have to think ourselves back to a time on the cusp between an earlier period when there was just a tangle of oral stories and a later period when these texts were actually written down. And Hesiod sits right on that cusp.
Right, so what we call Greek myth have bubbled up across the Greek world over hundreds of years?
Hundreds of thousands of years, possibly, yes. I mean, if you include the period after Hesiod, of course, when they're continuing to evolve in all sorts of other different directions.
Right, so when's Hesiod in this?
Hesiod is at the 8th century BCE. We can't be more precise than that. We don't really know what kind of individual he was. I mean, he tells us that he was a shepherd from, that's right, from Boeotia.
Yeah.
Whether we believe that or not, I mean, it seems plausible.
And so Hesiod writes the Theogony because he wants to tell the story of how the gods come into being, but he goes a bit beyond just the gods, right? I mean, he specifically goes to the trouble of telling us that Medusa's not immortal, so she isn't a god. So why does he include them? Just because they're monstrous and strange?
Well, Hesiod's Theogony is an absolutely extraordinary poem which tries to tell you the history of everything, if you like. It goes back to the origins of time itself, with chaos and the formation of the universe, through the generations of gods to the current Olympian order.
Yes.
But it also gives
the
us
new gods.
To the new gods, yes, exactly. The ones that overthrow the previous generation, the Titans.
Yeah.
And establish what is hoped to be a permanent order of divinity.
Right. So why then does he feel the need to include, for example, Gorgons? He could just tell stories about, you know, there are quite a lot of myths that are fairly local to Boeotia. He could just do those. He could just do nice wood nymphs. He tells us about the Muses who live in Mount Helicon. That's really nearby. That's where they meet him and fill him with inspiration. But he chooses to tell us about, amongst other things, the Gorgons who live incredibly far west.
Yeah.
Hesiod's not travelled to these kinds of places. And
no, it's a voyage of the imagination, isn't it? It's an extraordinary expression of expansion, if you like, at a time when Greeks are beginning to send out these colonial expeditions to found new cities across the Mediterranean world. And of course, Hesiod there in the centre is telling us that he has never really himself left the Greek mainland, except for a small trip across the strait. So he is really just a receptacle for all these stories that are coming back from the wider Mediterranean world. So what we've got with the Theogony is not just a history of time, but also an account of space in all its vastness in terms of the mapping out of the ancient Mediterranean.
Okay, so the Theogony is really a way in which Hesiod allows himself and his fellow Greeks to know where they came from and where they are.
Exactly, yeah.
And Gorgons are part of that.
The Gorgons are part of that because they're set in the far west, near what we call the Straits of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
So they're a way of plotting coordinates on the map of the Mediterranean world.
Okay, so we live here, a long way away from, for example, those Gorgons all the way over that.
Yes.
Right, okay.
The Gorgons live just beyond the western edge of Greek geography. I've already looked at one version of Medusa, but she's not the only version on Corfu. Like Greek culture, she metamorphosed and adapted over time. In Corfu's archaeological museum, as well as the giant Gorgon pediment, there are some smaller versions of Gorgon heads that show how her image changed over the centuries.
So these are Gorgonaea, Gorgon heads, the singular Gorgonaeon, and these are antefixes. So this is a decoration that you would put on the end of a pipe on a roof or something like that. And so what's really interesting about them in such close proximity is you can see just how much the image shifts over quite a short space of time. So this is archaic, this is the second half of the 6th century BCE, and you can tell because she looks more monstrous or maybe grotesque or extreme. You can see she's got the bulging eyes, she's got her tongue sticking out, a wide mouth. Again, you can tell that this creature is capable of making a loud noise, and she probably is making the loud noise because her tongue is out. You can see that she's got ringlets. This one doesn't seem to have snakes, but the crucial thing about her is the wide mouth and the protruding tongue. Shift to the one from the 4th century, and you can see that the teeth are much less visible. In fact, as far as I can see, she doesn't have teeth at all. This one has got proper jaws, you know, she's verging on tusks, but this one has a much more sedate looking mouth. She has, however, got some snake action coming in, again, just behind the ears. So her hair is still hair, it's not all snakes, but she does have a couple of snakes just slithering out. But you can see that the shift in the 5th century is to make monsters, especially female monsters, more beautiful. And it happens with sirens, it happens with gorgons, and this is a perfect illustration of it. So we have a sort of scarier, monstrous version shading into a sort of beautiful woman with a slight snake accoutrement type look.
Those snakes in the hair and animalistic connections are never far away in Medusa's story, capturing the fear and power of the unknown, the alluring danger of the wild.
Gorgon heads, in a way, they seem to tap into lots of different fears of the outside world, of the natural world. So they have often snakes for hair. Well, snakes might not be dangerous in the UK. They can be dangerous in Greek myth. Ask Eurydice, you can't. She died of being bitten by a snake. Ask Philoctetes, also unfortunate foot incident. They have tusks like wild boar. Again, not scary to me. I grew up in a city. I think a boar is just the same as a pig. It's not. Ask Adonis, the lover of Venus / Aphrodite. You can't. He died from having been gored by a wild boar. The wide mouth, perhaps thunderstorms, they don't seem as scary again to us because we've got double glazing, but I promise you, incredibly frightening in Greece. So probably these heads, these faces, which we find in all kinds of places, they seem to be both protective. People wear them on shields, the design on a shield, and perhaps also designed to ward things off. They are apotropaic, they're protective. So these are talismans to keep us safe.
But let's move Medusa's story forward, heading towards her woeful fate, as Hesiod puts it. Now, two of the best-known Olympian gods enter the story: Poseidon, the god of the sea, earthquakes and horses, and Athene, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. It takes me to the tall olive trees of Corfu.
You're probably wondering why I've brought you here to this olive grove. And the reason is that you can't talk about Athene without talking about olives. This is how she wins the city of Athens. Two gods vie to be the tutelary deity, the protective god for Athens, and they are Athene and Poseidon. Poseidon offers the Athenians a sea. Athene offers them the olive tree. Athens, of course, picks the olive tree, and Athene becomes their devoted protector. But it's not the only fight that Poseidon and Athene have. They also have a fight about Medusa. And the reason that they fight over Medusa is because Poseidon, like a lot of male Greek gods, decides that he should be able to have sex with anyone he chooses, and he chooses Medusa. He rapes her in the temple of Athene, according to Most of our sources in Pindar, they have a consensual encounter in a damp meadow, which, yes, is a euphemism in Greek as well as in English. But in our other sources, it's a non-consensual encounter. He rapes Medusa in Athene's temple. Athene doesn't punish Poseidon. She punishes Medusa. Medusa is literally the first monstered rape survivor. And she punishes her by turning her beautiful hair, her most gorgeous feature, according to Ovid in his Metamorphosis, into snakes.
Medusa's story was always more nuanced and more painful in its origins than in its more recent tellings. Perhaps it is easier to dehumanize Medusa and to see her as a monster than to acknowledge her pain. There's no evidence in the ancient sources that Medusa kills anyone while she's alive, while she has agency. But we've been encouraged to see her from the outside. How would we survive against her lithifying gaze? Our perspective changes depending on who is telling Medusa's story. What if we were the one sent to kill her?
Perseus enters the story. This young man is the son of Danae and Zeus, mortal woman, king of the gods. The only problem is that Danae's father, Acrisius, has heard an oracle that this baby will one day destroy him. He's so paranoid that he has Danae and baby Perseus locked up in a chest and cast out to sea. The gods intervene, of course, and Danae and Perseus wash up on the island of Seriphos.
Danae and Perseus are taken to a king named Polydectes. Polydectes, immediately obsessed with Danae and anxious to pursue her without her son around, sends Perseus off on a seemingly hopeless quest for the head of Medusa. Perseus has the gods on his side. As a son of Zeus, he receives divine help on his mission. Let's follow his route out to Medusa's cave. Athene and Hermes accompany him and find the nymphs who loan him winged sandals so he can travel at the speed of thought, and a kibesis, a special rucksack designed to carry a powerfully destructive item such as the severed head of a gorgon with a stony gaze. Perseus also borrows the cap of Hades, which holds the grim darkness of night, making the wearer invisible. The young man receives so much divine assistance in his quest to reach Medusa. An inadequate hero who needs all the help he can get.
And now we come to the saddest part of the story, where Perseus meets Medusa. A young hero sent on a quest by a petulant king to bring back the head of a gorgon. A young gorgon asleep in her cave with her sisters. It was always going to be her. She's the only mortal one, the only one Perseus could kill.
In the next episode, I follow Medusa's story to its horrifying conclusion and explore the way she's been portrayed beyond the Greeks, from ancient Rome to the Renaissance and the 21st century. Medusa has never left us. We left Medusa sleeping in the cave she shared with her sisters, while a young man arrived with murderous intent. Perseus, therefore, with Athene guiding his hand, kept his eyes on the reflection in a bronze shield as he stood over the sleeping Gorgons, and when he saw the image of Medusa, he sliced the Gorgon's teeming throat and stained his sickle red. He cut off the head and bathed, blood-stained, in the viperish dew.
This might just seem like hero slaying monster, but to at least some ancient Greeks, it seemed like the tragedy it seems to me.
And the tragic story of Medusa doesn't end there. In this episode, I'm staying on Corfu to explore what happened next in the shifting Greek versions of the story, and how Medusa has been shaped and reshaped through the Renaissance and into the 21st century. Let's take a long, hard look at Medusa. After she is killed, Medusa does not go unmissed. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, give chase, tumbling along behind Perseus, unapproachable, indescribable, straining to catch and grab him. With sharp, high noise, the teeth for their rage were made jagged, their stares fierce, and over their dreaded heads was great, shivering panic.
So when Perseus decapitates Medusa, something remarkable happens. The first is that she gives birth through her neck to two children sired by Poseidon. That's Pegasus, the flying horse, and Chrysaor, the golden giant. That's not all that happens, though. The drops of blood that drip from her neck onto the sands of Libya, we're told by Ovid in the Metamorphoses, produce all the snakes there are in Libya. The third thing to note is that her blood has remarkable properties in every sphere of life. Athene takes 2 drops of blood from Medusa, one from the left-hand side of her body and one from the right. She gives them to the god of healing, Asclepius. The drop of blood from the left-hand side of Medusa's body is lethal, a deadly poison. The drop of blood from the right-hand side of her body, the Greek word is soterian, saviour. It can revive you from the dead. Medusa has always been the monster who could save us.
Medusa's blood has extraordinary powers, but there's another part of her body that is even more potent.
And what happens to Medusa's severed head? Well, Perseus uses it as a weapon of mass destruction. First, he kills Katos, the sea monster. He turns Atlas into the Atlas Mountains. He petrifies a whole island full of people who've annoyed him. And he turns everyone at his wedding to stone. Having killed no one while she was alive, Medusa is used to kill hundreds of people after her death.
Medusa is so objectified that her head becomes nothing more than a destructive tool for Perseus. The myth of Medusa first emerged in a period of great evolution in Greek storytelling, the Archaic era, around 700 BCE, when Hesiod composed our first known account of the myth. But what about the writers who followed him? To explore how Medusa's story developed, I'm meeting Professor Tim Whitmarsh.
So Tim, what happens to the story of Medusa after the Archaic period?
By the time we hit what we call the classical period, the 5th century, is the retooling of the past. People begin to reimagine the store of stories that they had from the past and turn them into new shapes and new forms.
So the myths never stop changing. During the Archaic period, they're bubbling up across the Greek world, being composed and then eventually written down, and then that doesn't stop in the classical era because the world's still changing.
Yes, that's right. It's a common fallacy that there is a single core version of the myth which is then toyed with later. Of course, myth doesn't work like that. The world of mythology itself The myth is always changing, it's always metamorphosing, it's always taking on new shapes to reflect the needs of the society that produces it.
So who's up after Hesiod in terms of the next source that we have? Is it Pindar?
Pindar is the next fully surviving source that we have, who is writing a poem for a winner of the flute competition at the...
Come on, winning flute.
Now, Pindar's version is extraordinarily experimental because not only does Pindar like taking myths apart and putting them together in different orders, but he also, in this particular version of it, he uses the story of the decapitation of Medusa and focuses on the lament of the sisters for the death of Medusa. And
part of the story we lose when we make her a monster who lives alone in a cave, right? She's one of three sisters. Of course they lament for her.
Yes, of course, yes. And in this particular version of it, it's the lamentation of the sisters that is picked up by Athena, the goddess Athena, and she uses this as inspiration for the creation of the flute itself. But it also puts the accent on the suffering of the Gorgon sisters as well, which is perhaps an incidental thing for Pindar's aim, but for the history of the development of the story, it becomes really important because this leaves open a much more sympathetic possible reading of the Gorgon myth.
And then what happens to Medusa? What happens to the Gorgons after that?
Well, one of my favourite strands in the tradition, if you like, is the so-called rationalist tradition, where later Greeks, beginning in the 4th century BC, tried to work out versions of the story that don't have the supernatural elements in. They try to explain away all of the features that involve gods or paranormal phenomena generally.
Right, stripping away the monster in
snaky
nature.
hair and all that sort of thing.
Oh,
yes,
are you telling me she doesn't just lie down near some snakes? No wonder people mistook her for having snakes for hair. She just likes to lie among snakes.
Well, that's very much in the spirit, but no, I don't think we do have that in particular. But what we do get is an interesting flip in the story whereby Perseus becomes the real baddie in this version of the story. Perseus becomes a pirate who's marauding along the coast of North Africa, whereas Medusa is a very stately queen who is then subject to the depredations of the pirate Perseus, who comes along and immorally steals from the land.
And doesn't just steal, he kills her.
He kills her.
And I haven't misremembered this, have I? This is in Pausanias. He's so struck by her beauty, he then decapitates her so he can take the head to show people how pretty she was.
Yes, and that plays again on this duality that we always have with the Medusa myth, whether she is horrendously ugly or absolutely sensationally beautiful.
So the Medusa myth evolves through later Greek and Latin writers until we get to a version that's more familiar today.
Perhaps her most, if you like, canonical version of the story comes in a handbook of Greek mythology written by somebody who we call Pseudo-Apollodorus. Of course, he didn't.
I mean, we don't all call him Pseudo-Apollodorus.
No, and yeah, I'm sure he didn't call himself.
Quite a lot of people don't mention him at all. Yeah, come on.
But he gives us, he is a product of a period of Greek culture where they're really trying to make sense of their prior heritage. Another of these periods, I suppose, where they're trying to make sense of the prior heritage, but turn it into, they're trying to unpick all of the chronology of the story and stick it all together in a sequence to make it into a single continuous story. So Pseudo-Apollodorus' library of mythology is the version for the canonical version that we actually know.
Yes.
So it becomes the source for things like Clash of the Titans, the Ray Harryhausen movie.
More on the stop-motion movie magic later, but for now, it's no surprise that the script of Clash of the Titans chooses to put Perseus firmly in the heroic driving seat, avoiding the ancient nuances.
Well, I think this is one of the features of the Medusa myth, that in a sense it is multifaceted. It has all these different ways into it, but one of them is certainly, and it's picked up there in the ancient sources as well, is the idea that Perseus is no hero. One of our very latest sources for the Perseus myth is a poet called Nonus, who sets Dionysus, who is the hero of his epic, against Perseus and misses no opportunity to say Perseus is a mean-spirited, pathetic, vindictive, misogynist thug.
In familiar post-classical accounts, Medusa is separated from her family, from her Gorgon sisters, her sea monster parents, and her children. This solitary life makes her seem all the more disposable. No one will miss her. Beyond literature, Medusa has always been an incredibly tempting and saleable image.
Come to a souvenir shop in Corfu and you'll see that Medusa is everywhere. In fact, all the gods from this story are pretty well everywhere. Have a look over here. So here's a Gorgoneon, and you can see she's got the snakes for hair, she's got the wide mouth that's open, she doesn't have the big teeth, but she's unmistakable because look at the snakes twirling through her hair. And if you look along here, just a few of the gods that contributed to this story too. So here's Poseidon, whose rape of Medusa is what provokes Athene to render her hair into snakes in Ovid's version of the story in the Metamorphoses. Here's Athene, who obviously wears Medusa's head as part of her breastplate, part of her aegis. And here's Artemis, on whose temple the pediment, the Gorgon pediment, can be found. And you can see the replica just up there.
Getting into the souvenir buying mood, I've picked up a replica that mixes Medusas from different eras.
So, I found this vase that has a couple of different images of Medusa on, which illustrate the different versions of her that we've seen so far and the way she changes through time. It's quite an interesting piece. This side is based on an archaic image. So the vase painting that this is loosely copied from is a black figure vase painting. The red figure comes later, generally. This is close to the image by the Amasis painter that's held by the British Museum. She has the more extreme, the more animalistic features. So she has the wider mouth, the noisy mouth. She's got tusks. She's got the strong muscled arms, strong muscled legs. She's got the snakes for a belt. And so this version is very definitely giving us the image that is strange, perhaps monstrous, perhaps meant to be scary. Turn to the other side and we see a rather more tragic image of Medusa. So this is based on Todd Fawley painter and it's held in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And it shows Perseus handing over the decapitated head of Medusa to Athene. What's interesting about this image is that you can see that this Medusa is much more human. She's got a much smaller mouth. She's got much less protuberant eyes, a narrower nose. So she looks a lot more like a 4th century image of Medusa. So the extremes rendered more manageable, more human.
As Greek art evolved, Medusa became less obviously scary and more clearly wronged. Take a look at this image, one of my favourites.
This is one of the most beautiful and sympathetic depictions of Medusa in any art form. It comes from the mid-5th century BCE. It was made in Attica, so central Greece where Athens is. And it shows Perseus in the act of decapitating Medusa. He's looking behind him at another god. This is Athene, offering him advice. But look at Medusa. She's in a posture of like defensive sleep, the way children sleep, like this. So you can really see this 5th century beautification project in action here, the more monstrous face that we saw in those archaic images, the tusks, the beard, the snaky hair, that's all gone. Although we'll often see versions of Medusa with one or more of these characteristics later on, particularly the snakes. But this version of her looks incredibly human.
This image, painted 2,500 years ago, is perhaps Medusa at her least monstrous, her most innocent. Jump forward nearly 2 millennia, and she's reverted to terror. The Renaissance, the great revival of interest in classical art and culture, brought with it new attempts to portray and understand the mystery of Medusa's story.
So here are some of the most celebrated images of Medusa to come to us from Renaissance art and later. The first is, it's really horrible, the Rubens one, partly because it's quite gory. The snakes are everywhere. They're sort of writhing amid her hair rather than replacing it. The whole thing makes you feel a kind of visceral disgust, which I'm sure is the intention. The earliest version of Medusa that we have here is the Cellini, which is from the 1550s, and it's probably my least favourite image of Perseus and Medusa in any artistic medium, not because it's not an extraordinary piece of sculpture. It is, you can see everything. So this is Perseus as a naked young man. He's got a beautifully muscled body and he holds Medusa's head aloft. He's obviously afraid of her. The Canova is one of the more famous versions, and he's holding Medusa's head at arm's length. But he's not afraid of it. He's just looking at it. There's a sort of joke in there. As he looks at it, he, of course, himself has turned to stone because we're looking at the statue of him. So these versions of Perseus, he looks athletic, he looks young. Medusa is just a decapitated head. There's no sense of her as a person, as a character, as someone who has two sisters, as someone who'll be missed so deeply by them that they will lament for her in a way which makes someone else create a musical instrument to replicate the sound. And I always think you have to contrast them with Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of Judith beheading Holofernes, so a rare gender-switched version of a beheading myth in which Judith decapitates the general who's been holding her town under siege. She goes to his camp. She's allowed in by the guards because she's beautiful, and she and her maid decapitate him. There's nothing triumphant about it at all. It looks like a terrible ordeal that they're having to undergo. His eyes are facing away, so there's still no eye contact. There's blood everywhere. And when you compare that with the image of Perseus, you know, he looks pleased with himself. There's almost a slight smile playing on his lips. There's no sense of that with Judith. She looks like she's desperate for the moment to be over. There's nothing sexualized about it. No one is naked. It just looks brutal and necessary.
Medusa is a myth that isn't stuck in the past. She's one of the most iconic monsters in modern culture, still being prodded, poked and adapted to reflect the contemporary world. We just won't leave her alone. She's instantly recognisable. No small thanks for this goes to Hollywood directors. Let's take a look.
So I've talked you through the ancient Greek source version and indeed ancient Rome version of the story of Medusa. This is from 1981, a time almost as distant as ancient Greece.
I am, of course, talking about Ray Harryhausen's Clash of the Titans, featuring Harry Hamlin as Perseus. In this version, Medusa is really monstrous. She's depicted, I think for the first time, with a full snake body and armed with a bow and arrows, and she's alone in her lair. No sign of her Gorgon sisters.
This is a much more cinematic version. This Perseus isn't going on a quest to find the head of a Gorgon because a petulant king has asked him to. He's going on a much more heroic quest. He's going to get a Gorgon head to kill a sea monster and save Andromeda. The story of Andromeda is in the ancient sources, but it's a sort of incidental side quest that he saves Andromeda from Katos, the Greek sea monster. Harry Hamlin is saving her from the Kraken, which is an extra scary sea monster because it swum all the way down from Norse mythology to get to this film. The Kraken is quite a formidable, gigantic monster with what looks like 4 arms.
In Ray Harryhausen's version, Perseus arrives on Pegasus, who's been gifted to him by the gods, rather than born from Medusa's blooded neck.
Oh no, the Kraken has swiped Pegasus and they've both dived into the ocean. I'm delighted that the myth of Medusa endures in any form, really. I always think it's interesting. What I like about this version is that unlike a lot of late 20th, early 21st century versions, she's not sexy Medusa. The sort of sexy monster lady thing is really common. Unsexy Medusa, which is the version we see in Clash of the Titans, where she has a snaky tail, she has snakes for hair, she's just generally scary. She's picked up by Lego. Lego Medusa has got a snaky tail and snaky hair. And I sort of like the defiantly unsexy versions. I think it's a more wholesome monster in some ways. So yeah, I secretly love it.
I came to Corfu because it has one of the oldest representations of Medusa that we know. This fabulous pediment from the archaic temple of Artemis. Unlike the big-budget movie adaptations which take us on Perseus's journey, this Medusa dominates her own story. Mother of Pegasus and Chrysaor. Friend to wild beasts. To find out more about what Medusa means to Corfu, ancient and modern, I'm meeting up again with local archaeologist Eleanor Janega.
Do you think it's fair to say that Medusa has slightly eclipsed the goddess Artemis, whose temple she decorates?
Who wouldn't?
Who wouldn't? Look at the size
Who
of her.
wouldn't? The Gorgon is the main part of the pediment. Here in Corfu, we name the temple and the pediment the Gorgon pediment. So certainly she is the one that is the most important.
You know, I think of Gorgons, and certainly in ancient societies it seems reasonably clear that Gorgons have this dual nature. They can be scary, but they're also protective or apotropaic. Do you think of yours as being a scary or a protective one?
Why not being both? This is presented here as a monster, but at the same time she is protecting her whole community.
Right, and so do you think that Medusa is important to the people of Corfu?
Of course, she is popular with the locals and of course with children. You have to have in mind that in Greece, children are being introduced to history, starting with mythology at around the age of 8. So of course, the teachers are bringing the children here to discuss about the museum in general and ancient Corfu, but of course, the main theme is always the Gorgon.
Beyond the island of Corfu, Medusa is a globally recognisable symbol in popular culture. We can see her everywhere. She is beautiful and hideous, desirable and dangerous, and still so malleable in the hands of others. Time for a nighttime journey into Corfu town, a chance to reflect on where Medusa stands right now.
If you're wondering where Medusa has gone in recent years, the answer is she is everywhere. Here she is 10 years ago on the 25th anniversary issue of GQ magazine. This is Rihanna, of course, as styled by Damien Hirst. He's using so much Medusa art imagery here. The hair completely replaced by snakes, so really channeling the Caravaggio image that we looked at. She's wearing the snake that's wrapping around her neck. She reminds me, at least, of the pediment Medusa here with the snakes wrapped around her waist. She's got snake contact lenses in, if you look closely. And of course, she's not wearing a top because, you know, Damien Hirst always really worries that Rihanna will get too hot. And the image hasn't gone anywhere over the last few years. In 2016, we saw a lot of images which showed the eventual president of the United States as Perseus and Hillary Clinton as Medusa. People were glad, I'm afraid, to see her decapitated. My favourite modern image of Medusa is this one. It was by a sculptor named Luciano Garbati. He's an Italian-Argentine sculptor. He created a statue which gender reversed the Canova that you can see in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So this is a naked, beautiful, young Medusa, and she's holding the decapitated head of Perseus. Some versions of the image were just this, white statue on black background. Some had text. Next to Medusa's head at the top of the screen, it reads, "Be thankful we only want equality." Next to Perseus' decapitated head, it read, "And not payback." Medusa is always with us. She is always the beautiful and the terrified.
We've gazed closely into Medusa's eyes, and we've found a far more complicated story than the usual retelling of the myth, the modern tropes. A mortal Gorgon, an extraordinary woman with a terrible fate.
The image of Medusa is one of the most iconic and enduring in Greek myth. People ask you to name a monster, she's often top of the list with her snaky hair,
and her stony gaze. But in all of this iconography, we have forgotten something which is integral to her nature. The word Medusa in Greek means guardian. She wants to protect us.
Kind of a big question. Which heroes fought in the Trojan War? It's a bit of a list. Famously, they were pretty bad at it at first, but they quickly learned. I wonder if this question is meant for me. Did the Greeks have navies? Yes, they did. In fact, earlier than they did cavalry. Hello everyone, my name is Roel Konijnendijk. I'm ancient historian at Lincoln College, University of Oxford, and I'm here to answer frequently asked questions about my field, ancient Greek warfare. First, I'm going to answer some general questions, and then we're going to go into a few more specific questions about the Trojan War, about the Persian Wars, Peloponnesian War, and some other conflicts. And hopefully we'll have some interesting things to say. Who did the Greeks fight? Everyone. I mean, basically everyone they could find. And if they couldn't find you, they would give it a good go looking for you. Greeks in this period, in ancient times, thought of war as pretty normal. It was quite a big part of their lives to jump to warfare as a way to resolve conflicts between themselves and other communities. So they often fought wars with their neighbors over perceived slights, over injustice, over territorial disputes, over questions of honor, legitimacy, breaking of the rules, whatever else. And so warfare was quite a common thing for them. But they also fought wars against non-Greeks around them. So they fought wars against the Thracians and the Etruscans and the Carthaginians and the Persians, of course, and peoples of North Africa. Everywhere they encountered people, either because they were themselves trying to carve out territory, or because those peoples, either wanted them gone or had their own expansionist designs in mind. So who did the Greeks fight? Yes, basically everyone in the world. Next question. How did the Greeks fight? That's kind of a big question. I spend a lot of time studying this. They have very limited means of mustering military force because they don't have a lot of money, they have small populations, most of their population can't leave home for any length of time without crashing the economy essentially. So how did the Greeks fight? Well, in really quite modest ways most of the time. A lot of their early wars were essentially border raids. Later on they do start mustering large citizen armies, but those armies are just composed of regular citizens and they can't leave home for very long. Only a few states had the means to do things like build elaborate fortifications or put together war fleets. And it's only later when these states grow richer and more populous and more powerful that they start to have, overseas campaigning, overseas conquest, prolonged campaigns like sieges and things like that. So how the Greeks fight initially in very basic ways. And then later on, their warfare becomes more and more complex, and they start to be able to take on bigger and bigger opponents. And this obviously culminates in the end with, Alexander the Great uniting the Greek world and taking on the Persian Empire. What weapons did the Greeks fight with? They would use spears and swords, javelins, bows, slings, all the kind of weapons that you find on a pre-modern battlefield. The average Greek warrior, perhaps, just numerically speaking, was a light-armed warrior who fought with a rock, perhaps, that he found on the battlefield if there was nothing else, but otherwise with some javelins, with a bow and arrow, or with sling stones. If he had a bit more money to equip himself, because the state was not paying for any of his equipment, he had to afford it for himself. If he had the money, he might buy some body armor, he might buy a long thrusting spear and a shield, and then fight that way. In that style of fighting, short swords were also prominent secondary weapons. Early in the 4th century BC, they developed a totally new kind of weapon which can throw projectiles at much greater range than anything else and larger projectiles than a human being can project. But this is something that develops first in that period, and initially these weapons are really quite modest. We should imagine them as sort of large bolt shooters. And it takes a while for that to really develop a presence within Greek warfare. And then, of course, the other weapon they fight with is warships, which are themselves kind of a weapon. Their main warship, the trireme, is itself essentially a floating ram. It has a very large crew of rowers to allow that ship to get stuck into other ships, to ram them and hopefully either sink or disable them. So that is itself kind of also a weapon, but fundamentally that is the full range of what the Greeks would use. Next question, did the Greeks fight on chariots? It's an interesting question, actually. Chariots appear in Homer. So in the Iliad, there are warriors fighting in chariots. They jump off them to fight, and then they jump back on to get away. So they don't really fight in chariots, but they use them as something that's been described as like battlefield taxis, essentially. They use them to get around quickly. And historians are divided over whether that's a real practice, maybe from the early archaic period, so from the 8th or 7th century BC that they really did this, or whether this is essentially something that the poet doesn't quite understand, it's fantasy, or it's something that maybe is reflecting a bad memory, a badly preserved memory of earlier times, the Bronze Age, when this kind of chariot would be more common. Next question, did the Greeks have cavalries? Yes, they did. This is something that's sometimes considered to be like un-Greek or alien to the Greek world, because we have some battles, like in the Persian Wars, where the Greeks don't seem to have any men fighting on horseback. And the assumption has long been that this is because, horses just don't feature very much in Greek warfare. But the fact is that shortly after the Persian Wars, you get very prominent accounts of the capabilities of cavalry from Thessaly, from Boeotia, from Asia Minor, from other parts of the Greek world. And it's spreading from there until towards sort of the middle of the 4th century, about a century after the Persian Wars. It seems like every Greek state worth its salt will have some cavalry of its own. So this is something that is emerging in the period of the Persian Wars. It's not quite developed yet, but soon after that it becomes very normal. And this cavalry has a very important role to play in Greek warfare. There are a lot of different roles that cavalry is especially suited for. Protecting farmland, harrying the enemy, keeping them together, keeping them in place, fighting their scouts, fighting their outriders, preventing them from plundering, but also, for instance, fighting in battles, being this mobile force that can intervene where needed, and often actually deciding the outcome of pitched battles. Cavalry is a huge part of Greek warfare, and towards the end of the classical period, they actually become such a big feature of it, that when Alexander the Great musters his army to cross into Asia to attack the Persian Empire, there are more Greek horsemen in his army than Macedonian and Thracian horsemen put together. There's a huge element of his force that is Greek cavalry, because the Greeks have so many of these horsemen ready for battle. Did the Greeks have navies? Yes, they did. In fact, earlier than they did cavalry, as we've just discussed. I mean, they had navies at least from the late 6th century onwards and probably later. And some of their most famous exploits in war are thanks to their large fleets of warships. The Greeks live by the sea. Naval connections and trade were extremely important to them. And of course, they realized early on that if you could dominate those, if you could secure and protect those sea lanes, then it would give you a special amount of power. Your influence over, for instance, island states would be absolute, because no one could get to those states without your permission, without your say-so. So Greeks start developing this idea of naval power, thalassocracy, rule of the sea, quite early on. And by the time of the Persian Wars, you have different states already vying for naval power. Aegina, Athens, Samos are all noted naval powers. Many of those are conquered by the Persians and used to build a fleet to send against Greece. But it is the Athenian-led, or the Spartan-led, but mostly Athenian fleet of the coalition against the Persians that wins the great victory at Salamis, that actually drives off the Persian fleet and more or less turns the tide of the Persian Wars. So from then on, the Athenian navy becomes this huge factor in the Aegean. They end up projecting their power into the Black Sea, into the Eastern Mediterranean, into Sicily, everywhere else. Athenian naval power becomes one of the driving forces of the history of the 5th century. Next question, did the Greeks do sieges? Again, famously, they were pretty bad at it at first, but they quickly learned. So initially in Greek history, sieges don't really seem to happen. Sometimes cities are taken by surprise. Sometimes cities are quickly overrun, but you don't really get good stories of, prolonged operations against a fortified settlement. The story of the Trojan War is kind of exceptional because we hear of this 10-year war against the city. But when you read Homer, you realize that the way it's described is not actually a siege. The Greeks are just kind of sitting outside of that city, and they have battles in the plain between the city and the Greek camp. So it's really not a siege in the way that we understand it, with engines going up to the walls and people being starved out. And in fact, it's only decided because of this famous trick with the Trojan horse. And the reason for that, I've already mentioned, these Greek states have very limited means. Keeping an army in the field is very expensive, it's very difficult. It requires a lot of logistical know-how to be able to get supplies to them and to be able to keep these men in operational activity when they're not away, when they're not tending to their fields and their shops and whatever else they have at home. So they are out of your economy. You're projecting them out into the world and using them for a military campaign. It's very difficult for a small community to sustain that. So initially, Greek sieges are, they have to be very limited. If they're not over quickly, they don't happen at all. Did the Greeks dig ditches? I wonder if this question is meant for me. Surprisingly, not that much. Much to my disappointment, obviously. But the Greeks sometimes would try and reinforce a settlement with a ditch, for instance, on a side of the walls that was facing a plain. If it's easy to approach, you dig a ditch in front of that and you'll be much safer, because it becomes more difficult for an enemy with engines or ladders to approach your walls. But generally speaking, Greek fortified settlements and forts were placed in easily defensible positions. So for instance, on hilltops, on mountainsides, or on sort of promontories sticking out into the sea. So most of these Greek positions rely on natural defenses, which are reinforced by building walls, reinforced with towers and parapets and all sorts of things, but fundamentally don't rely on earthworks in the same way that fortifications do in places where the land is more flat and where it's easier to construct those things. Next question. Who was the best Greek warrior? Canonically, Achilles. He's famously described as best of the Greeks and legendarily the best warrior among the Greeks in the Trojan War story. Historically, there's much less interest in this kind of question. There isn't so much a sense that individual warriors make or break the fate of campaigns, and so there isn't as much of a sense that individuals should be considered the best of the Greeks and should be honored accordingly. You get a couple of battles in which Herodotus, who is a historian, he is still describing for us who was awarded within the Greek army with the prize for valor. We hear of Sophanes among the Athenians, and also Pythias, an Aeginetan marine who fought so nobly during the Battle of Artemision against the Persians, or some of the actions before that the Persians actually captured him and took care of him and treated his wounds so that they could have him fighting on their side since his ship had been captured. So there was some understanding that some of these warriors had done sort of great things and that they deserved to be honored for it. But when we hear about what those things actually are, I mean, there's very little detail. I mean, this is really just about the basic level of valorous conduct, just being willing to stand and fight and face the enemy, even at the expense of your own life. Next question. Was the Trojan War real? Kind of a big question. There's a couple different things to distinguish here. Like, one thing is that the story that we know comes primarily from the Homeric epic poems, right? So these are tales that were written down around the year maybe 700 BC, maybe a little later. They're the earliest sources written in the Greek alphabet that survived down to our time. The time in which they believe the Trojan War took place conforms more or less, if we squint, to the very end of the Bronze Age in Greece, when Mycenae was a very powerful kingdom and when one of the layers of the ancient city of Troy was destroyed. And so it's been incredibly tempting for many historians to say that these things are not coincidence, that there was a real Trojan War at the end of the Bronze Age, and that when Homer, or when the poet putting together the epics, referred to this war as happening in the heroic past, they were actually referring to the traces of a real memory of a historical event. And some people are very optimistic about this. They say we have plenty of evidence from Hittite sources and from archaeology to attest that there was a real Trojan War. Others are much more cautious and say we really cannot say, even if we have these pieces, whether this is in any sense the Trojan War that is described by Homer, or whether any of the characters or any of the events that were described in the epic cycle have any relation to real history. I am myself on the skeptical camp. I don't think the Trojan War ever actually happened. What we're dealing with is an epic poem about a story that fits very, very nicely within the world of early archaic Greece in terms of how societies are organized, how they're run, what the concerns of the individual people are, where they're based and what they do and what kind of equipment they carry. This is an early archaic Greek world. That's what's being described to us, and that's why these poems are interesting. Next question, who started the Trojan War? Different accounts of that. It's a story that goes further and further back. You know, there's always sort of a first cause for everything. According to the sources on the Trojan War, so the epic cycle, the first instigator was Zeus, who wanted to trigger it. And so he sent Eris, the goddess of strife, to a wedding party to essentially provoke a fight between different goddesses about who was the most beautiful, which they submitted for arbitration to Paris, who was a Trojan, who didn't know at the time he was a Trojan prince. He gave the apple, gave the prize, gave the title of the most beautiful to Aphrodite in exchange for the promise that Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, would fall in love with him. But Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, or rather, Helen of Sparta was already married to Menelaus, who was therefore king of Sparta. And so when she fell in love with Paris, he abducted her and took her to Troy, which then triggered the Trojan War. Now, this is, it's a complicated story. It has many different phases and episodes. This is basically the way that it's understood. Herodotus, in the beginning of his history, tries to tie this Trojan War into a wider narrative of conflict between Asia and Europe. And this kind of reflects something about the way the Greeks talked about this in the 5th century. So he says that it goes even further back than that there were other occasions where mythical figures like Io had been stolen by other people. So earlier peoples had stolen, women from Asia or women from Europe and taken them with them. And this created this sort of prolonged series of tit for tat. Who was Helen of Troy? Helen of Sparta, rather, was the daughter of the daughter of Zeus, technically. And she was eventually married off to Menelaus, who was one of the Atreides, so one of the brothers, the sons of Atreus. So that was a big event. There were many suitors to Helen's hand because as a daughter of Zeus, she was reputed to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And at the end of that, her choice for Menelaus, all the other suitors were made to swear a pact, were made to swear an oath that they would defend the sanctity of this marriage between Helen and Menelaus, which is what is activated when Helen is abducted from Sparta and the Trojan War begins, essentially. Next question. Did the gods fight in the Trojan War? According to the story, they absolutely did. In fact, they caused it, and they chose sides in it. So several different gods have their favorites. Athena is very much on the Greek side, Hera, and along with Hera as well, of course, because Paris chose against her. Aphrodite is very much on the Trojan side because Paris chose her. And there are other gods involved as well. Poseidon, Ares, Apollo, they all play their part. But various others are there to protect their own offspring, for instance, or to put their finger on the scales. At one point, Zeus wants to save his son Sarpedon and is told off by Hera because if he started doing it, all the other gods would want to do that too, like save their children from death in battle. So that kind of thing is absolutely, it's a huge factor in the story that was told, the poem that was written about the Trojan War. Which heroes fought in the Trojan War? It's a bit of a list. It's got a huge cast of characters. In fact, there's almost an inexhaustible supply of heroes, especially when you have heroes going on a rampage, going on what's called Aristeia, so an act of a series of glorious deeds. They seem to be killing heroes left and right that are all named. They get a name and a patronym. Sometimes they get an epithet, or they get some kind of detail about their backstory, about their looks, their skills, their origins, their family. You get all sorts of details about these heroes. There's an absolutely vast cast of characters associated with the Trojan War in the epic poems. Only a handful of those are famous enough to now feature in a lot of stories and versions of this. You have your Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Aias, Ajax, the two different Ajaxes actually, because there are several. On the Trojan side, of course, Hector, Paris, Aeneas. But when you then later read the rest of the story, you find that there's an enormous number of additional heroes below the level of these absolute top leaders. And so in terms of which heroes fought in the Trojan War, I mean, the list is literally endless, because as soon as Homer or whoever else, another poet, needs another character, a named character to get involved in a debate or a fight, they can just, generate more. There seems to be an absolutely inexhaustible list of them. What was the Trojan horse? It's an interesting question. At its most basic level, the Trojan horse was the trick that either Epeius or Odysseus used to try and infiltrate Troy. So they built a horse, they left it behind on the beach, they pretended to flee, the Greeks. The Trojans decided that the Greeks had left, that they'd won the war. They took the horse with them as a trophy into the walls. Supposedly they even had to break down some of their walls to make room for it because the horse was so big. They brought it into the walls and they celebrated and they got drunk and they fell asleep. At that point, the Greeks who had hidden themselves away inside the horse came out, opened the gates to the Greeks who had returned quietly, and that was how the city fell. So the Trojan horse is a famous sort of, metaphorical symbol still of the idea of infiltrating in secret. You are able to come in with something else that was invited, and the people who are doing it don't realize that you're in that horse. Who won the Trojan War? The Greeks. Agamemnon, Menelaus. He got his wife back. That's what he was fighting for. Fundamentally, this is the end of the Trojan Wars, that Troy is destroyed. It is sacked thoroughly by the Greeks. The city is burned down, and supposedly everybody dies except for those who get away. So later, peoples not just the Romans who famously did this with Aeneas, but many, many peoples around the world have claimed to be the last surviving Trojans who fled and resettled somewhere else. Germanic tribes did this in Roman times, and many other peoples have claimed to be the Trojans who got away from the destruction of the city. But the Greeks, thanks to the Trojan horse trick, they absolutely win. They achieve their aim. They destroy the city. They kill Priam and his family. They enslave most of the women they capture, which leads to many tragic stories after that, when the fate of the horrible fate of these women is considered. And it leads into other stories such as the Odyssey, as the Greek heroes try to get home. Next question, why was the Trojan War important? I mean, so we can't talk about it historically. It's a little bit difficult because there's just no way to prove that this actually happened. If it did actually happen, then the only outcome was that the city of Troy was burned down and later resettled. But in terms of literature and culture, we can say the Trojan War is important because it is the story for the Greeks. This is absolutely the story they all know, the story they all tell. This is something that binds the Greeks together culturally. And so the Trojan War is an enormously important story, and especially Homer, especially the Iliad and the Odyssey, are just absolute cornerstones of Greek culture. And they see them, in fact, they see Homer as this unimaginable sage who is both the first historian and the first tactician and the greatest poet, and they think of him as basically being the pinnacle of all their learning, the one who gave the example for every possible thing that you could want to know about the world. So for them, this is essentially the start and the foundation of all knowledge, is to learn your Homer. And they all know it, they can all quote it, they can all recite it at each other. This is the text that absolutely everyone knows. Within that world, there is no text more important than the Homeric epics. Why did the Greeks fight the Persians? The Persian Empire emerges very suddenly in the middle of the 6th century BC, and then at that point it's basically everybody's problem. So the Persians continue to expand for a long period of time. They successfully subject the entire Middle East, Iran, parts of Central Asia, what is today Turkey and Egypt. They spread out over all these regions, and the Greek world, which is doesn't necessarily overlap just with the modern state of Greece, is essentially next in their path. So they conquer parts of the Greek world early on in their conquest in the 540s BC, and that part of the Greek world rebels in 499 BC. So that's called the Ionian Revolt, because the revolt of a couple of city-states around Ionia, which is this part of the coast of what is now Turkey. People who are leading that rebellion go to the mainland Greeks and ask for help. Most of the Greeks turn them down, but the Athenians and the Eretrians say, yes, we'll support you. They briefly do, they don't achieve very much. But at that point, the Persians become aware of the existence of these other Greek states, and the story that we are told is that from that moment, it was clear that that was going to be their next target. So why did the Greeks fight the Persians? Either because the Persians just continue to expand continuously throughout the first half century of their existence as an empire, and so Greece is just next in their path and it was inevitable. But according to the Greeks, it's also because, according to the Greeks themselves, it's also because the Greeks more or less provoked them. So there are different stories in which they essentially either harm or slight or dishonor or destroy parts of Persian land, force, temples, etc., and that the Persians think it is, vengeance is due, essentially. So that is why the Greeks fight the Persians. Next question, where was the Persian War? The Persian War is presumably... Initially, all of this fighting happens in what is now Western Turkey. So there's a couple of different campaigns to subdue the rebellious Greeks, which the Persians do quite handily. I mean, it takes them a few years, but they win all their battles, they win all their sieges, which they're much more capable of doing than the Greeks themselves because of the resources and experience they've built up. And so the Persians initially sort of re-establish their control over Asia Minor, over what is now Turkey. But then they cross over into Europe. Now, they've already done that previously, so they've subjected Thrace and Macedon and some other regions, but they never kind of turned against the mainland Greek world. So now, at this point, first Darius advances across, or has his generals advance across the Aegean. So they go island to island into the west. They take a number of these islands, Euboea, Naxos, and then they land in Attica, near Athens. But that's where they are defeated at the Battle of Marathon, which is, a marathon away from Athens, literally, 42 kilometers. That's where that first big encounter happened, and that's where the Greeks learned, oh, you can win this. That's interesting. 1 decade later, Xerxes, who succeeded Darius, his father, invades again with a big royal army. He crosses into Europe, across the Hellespont. He advances first west and then south into mainland Greece. And the campaigns of that war are essentially fought around central Greece. So we're talking about Thermopylae, which is just north of modern Theba, and then south of there, south to the southwest of that, Plataea is where the decisive land battle is fought. Naval battles happen sort of just to the east in the coastal regions, first at Artemision and then at Salamis south of Athens. That's where the big battles are fought. Next question, who won the Persian War? Depends on how long you put your time brackets, always fun. Initially, the Persian invasions were thwarted. The Battle of Marathon cements the fact that Darius can advance no further west. So his campaign was a big success up to the point where he landed on the mainland, but that's where he was stopped. Then Xerxes' army and fleet are essentially destroyed by the Greeks. So that the big events of 480 to 479 is that this Persian invasion force is wiped out. And that puts a stop to Persian expansion permanently. In fact, they never resume any expansion towards the west, except that they continue to try and assert their control over the west, which also involves kind of relationships of vassalage with the Greek state. So they no longer try to outright conquer them, but they try to throw their weight around to make sure that these Greeks can't form a threat to Persia or infringe on the Persian ability to rule over Asia Minor, what is now Turkey. So when you're talking about who won the Persian Wars, I mean, fundamentally it is the Athenians or the Greeks, more generally the Greek alliance, that wins. But in the long run, the Persians do manage to claw back control over the regions that they were pushed out of, and eventually even get to a position where they more or less get to decide policy between the Greek states just by saying, whoever is doing anything that we don't like, we're going to support their enemies. And they support their enemies with money and ships, which are the kind of things that most of these Greek states struggle to afford. And it allows them to wage war on a much higher level and maintain empires at the kind of scale that they want. And so they end up really wanting Persian support, really vying for Persian support, and in the process kind of submitting themselves to a world that is dominated by Persia. Why was the Persian War important? Again, in terms of modern scholars have argued a lot about whether it actually matters that the Persians were defeated. In an institutional sense, the argument that this was somehow hugely important for the Greeks has been debunked to some extent by people who point out that the Greeks living under the Persian yoke already in Asia Minor get to live more or less the way they want. And in fact, even according to Herodotus, get to have things like democratic forms of government as long as they do the bidding of the Persian king. So culturally, it may not have been that important that they were able to avoid subjection to the Persians. It may not have meant that, Greek culture was preserved or the products of Greek political and cultural and literary life were allowed to flourish. A lot of that stuff may well have happened under Persian rule just as much as it did after the victory. However, there is a way in which this victory was very important to the Greeks in the sense that it really galvanized their understanding of themselves as a culture that's quite apart from the Persians. So they start to think of themselves much more strongly as Greeks, Greeks against the world, Greeks against the East, and they start to think of that status as that identity as something worth celebrating. And that in itself may well have been one of the instigators of a lot of the cultural production that follows. A lot of the kind of things that they start making and doing, creating and imagining comes out of this understanding that they are something special in the world because they were able to stop Persian expansion where all the other peoples around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East had failed to do so. Did the Spartans fight the Athenians? Yes, many times. There are at least 5 wars throughout the classical period. So we have the so-called First Peloponnesian War, the Archidamian War, the Ionian Decalaean War, and the Corinthian War, and the Boeotian War. So there are many different wars in which the Spartans fight the Athenians for a period of about 90 years, which is sometimes grouped together and called something like the hegemonic wars. So it's the wars over hegemony of the Greek world. So they are vying for partial or total control over the Greeks as the leading state within that community of smaller states. Why was it called the Peloponnesian War? It's an excellent question. Actually, there were different names for this war. The Peloponnesian War is ancient as a name, as a label, but there were different names for this war that already existed in ancient times. So the reason we call it the Peloponnesian War is primarily because we tend to look at it through the eyes of an Athenian source, Thucydides, and his successor as a historian, Xenophon, who were both Athenian. So they are talking about the war of the Peloponnesians against Athens. So that's why it's called the Peloponnesian War. But of course for them, as Thucydides himself says, it was the Athenian War. How long did the Peloponnesian War last? The thing is, actually, it breaks down into 2 wars. The first one is about 10 years, then there's about 7 years of peace in which various campaigns were waged, including the Athenian expedition against Sicily. And then there's another period of 10 years of war, which is a much more all-out conflict. Who won the Peloponnesian War? Sparta. Surprise upset. Everybody thought actually that they would win. Not necessarily because they were the better warriors or because they had the larger army, but because they were taking the war to Attica. They were invading Attica every year. And it was generally thought in the Greek world that the Athenians wouldn't be able to stand this for very long. Their resources would run out. They would run out of food and money, and so they eventually would have to surrender. But they didn't. For a long time, they fought on. And this is something that surprised a lot of Greeks and actually made them think like, oh, this is not going the way that we thought. It seems like their resources are greater than any other state that has existed within this Greek world, and as a result they're able to sustain warfare even if they are kind of taking more of the losses than their enemies. They're able to keep going. So this war had kind of an unusual course, and the Greeks themselves were quite baffled by what was going on. And the only reason the Spartans are eventually able to win is because they get the support of the Persians. So first of all, it's because the Athenians make some terrible mistakes. They lose half their fleet in Sicily, but they're able to bounce back from that and actually cling on to a lot of the power that they'd established in the Aegean, which is, again, something that really impressed other Greeks and made them wonder if the power of Athens would ever actually be humbled. But once the Spartans managed to make an agreement with Persia to finance naval warfare, the Spartans are able to challenge the Athenians at sea, and that proves to be decisive. Now, I say that proves to be decisive. It doesn't immediately prove to be decisive. The Spartans actually lose their entire fleet twice over, but ultimately they are able to wear the Athenians down simply because the Athenian resources are constantly dwindling as they have to support this war alone. Whereas the Spartans, every time something goes wrong, they call Mr. Great King of Persia and say, could we have some more money, please? And all their losses are made good. Next question. What happened after the Peloponnesian War? Kind of a long story. I mean, all of history, technically. What happened now immediately after the Persian War is that obviously Athens had to surrender its empire. So the empire was dissolved, their fleet was scrapped, their walls were torn down, the long walls and the walls of Piraeus, their harbor. And Athens was made a subject ally of the Spartans, so they had to do the Spartans' bidding. And for a little while they do. But soon discontent with Spartan overlordship starts to take hold not only in Athens but also elsewhere. So there are other states as well that no longer enjoy existing in a world in which Sparta at this point has unrivaled hegemony. So they completely call the shots around the Greek world. They're not happy about that because they're constantly being made to fight wars against people who they have no particular quarrel with. They're constantly being made to campaign in all sorts of places that they don't want to have anything to do with. And they're unhappy with the outcome of the Peloponnesian War in general. They don't think they got their share of the spoils or their share of the benefits for fighting that war on the Spartan side. And so a lot of their Spartan allies become disaffected and the Athenians join that camp. And in 395 BC, so only 9 years after the end of the Peloponnesian War, these states band together and declare war on Sparta again. And that triggers the Corinthian War, which is a whole other story. But the fundamental point is that the Peloponnesian War doesn't settle the business of who should be in charge of the Greek world. So the questions that we've covered here really only sort of discuss a couple of the most famous wars. There are many others that continue into the 4th century. And the big one, of course, is first the subjection of the Greek world to Macedon, which happened under Philip II, and then the great conquest of his son, Alexander the Great. I haven't covered that in detail. There will be another video coming up here on History Hit. And if you enjoy that, please look out for it. And thanks very much for watching.
Doctors who argue that women should be marrying earlier, before puberty. Women would also be very involved in religion. There are certain Greek women who win Olympic prizes. Hi, I'm Eleanor Cargill-Martin. I am a classicist and I'm here today to answer the most Googled questions about ancient Greek women. So, first question. Was Helen of Troy real? So Helen of Troy is a legendary figure. She's meant to be the most beautiful woman in the ancient Greek world, and she appears in the narrative of the Great Trojan War. And she comes down to us for the first time in writing in the works of Homer around 800 BC. And she is meant to be half mortal, half god. She is the daughter of the Spartan queen Leda and the god Zeus. And in some of the stories, she actually hatches out of a swan's egg. There are debates about how much of the narrative of the Trojan War was potentially based in reality that was passed down in oral tradition. So it's possible that Helen was based originally on some Mycenaean princess from the Bronze Age, but she probably did not hatch out of a swan's egg. Next question. Who was the most famous Greek woman? I would have to say probably Sappho, who is a incredibly famous poet. She writes in lyric poetry around 600 BC, and she is from the island of Lesbos. Her main theme is love. She writes about all of its eroticism, all of its emotion, the jealousy, the desire, and she is incredibly famous in the Greek world. She's known among Greek writers as the 10th muse, so the 10th goddess of artistic production. She appears on pottery, on people's wall paintings. So she's a real icon to the Greeks, and a lot of people essentially copy her style of poetry, and the meter that she writes in comes to be known as the Sapphic meter. And her works continued to be copied and read even after antiquity. We have fragments of them now, and of course she's also famous to us because a lot of her poems are written from the point of view of a woman who is having a love affair or is desiring another woman, and so the name Sappho and her birthplace Lesbos have come to be the words that we use for lesbian and sapphic. So next question, did Athenian democracy include women? Absolutely not. Women in Athens cannot vote, they cannot hold political office, they cannot attend the assemblies, they cannot even kind of represent themselves or appear in court. And one of the ways that Athenian democracy functions so well is because it defines the male citizen body in contrast to outsiders, so in contrast to foreigners, in contrast to slaves, and in contrast to women. It's interesting and quite ironic that we perceive Athens to be the birthplace of just rule and political rights, when really it was a very oppressive regime for the vast majority of people who lived there. Next question. So could Greek women vote? So we've just established they couldn't vote in Athens, and in fact I can't think of a single place in Greece that they could vote. But it is important to remember that the Greek world is made up of all these different kingdoms and city-states that all have their own forms of rule. Some of them are democracies, some of them are oligarchies, so ruled by the wealthy, some of them are tyrannies or monarchies. In some of those political systems, women would have been able to exert more power. So for example, if you have a monarchical system, the women who are within the king's family might be able to exert a lot of unofficial political power, but they won't be able to vote. Next question, were Greek women involved in politics? So we've covered this to some extent. Women generally couldn't vote, and in certain city-states like Athens, they were entirely politically sidelined. In monarchies, they could have a lot more power through influencing the men around them, but again, that is going to be limited to a very small number of women. As you get into later Greek history, there is more evidence of wealthy women being kind of honored by their city. So we sometimes get women being given actually magistracies as a sort of reward for making big donations to civic funds. And there's just a lot more evidence of women being kind of involved in that civic side of life. Next question. Did the Spartans respect women? This is such an interesting question. So the Athenian writers who write about Sparta and who sadly make up the majority of our sources really focus on what is so different between Athens and Sparta. And one of the things that they notice is that the Spartans treat their women very differently. And the Athenians obviously think that this is quite shocking. So the Spartans encourage young women to take part in kind of physical activity, in races, in singing, in performances. And then later on, the Spartan women are still allowed to own property, they're allowed to inherit, they're allowed to, seemingly exert quite a lot more power in the society. Does that necessarily translate to the Spartans respecting women in the way that we would understand today? Their main role was still procreation and marriage. So one of the key reasons that the Spartans are encouraging young girls to kind of train in physical activity is because they want them to be strong, because the belief is if the mother is strong, she is going to birth a strong son who is going to become a strong soldier for the Spartan state. That being said, we do have a lot of evidence of Spartan women exerting a lot of political power. And there are also instances in which a Spartan community will honor a woman for some achievement. So there's a woman called Konijnendijk, who is the first woman to achieve a victory at the Olympic Games by sponsoring a charity team. After her victory, the Spartans actually set up essentially a hero shrine to her in the center of the town. We found inscriptions honoring her. And so there suddenly is, I think, more of a respect for women's possible achievements. So because there are these very different kind of outlooks on women's roles in society, a lot of these questions are going to have different answers depending on what part of Greece you're looking at. So next question, could Greek women leave the house? This is such an interesting question, and it's actually still an ongoing matter of scholarly debate. There is certainly an ideal, at least in Athens, that women will live a life that is secluded, that they will ideally remain within the domestic sphere, that they won't be seen by people outside the home. There's even an idea in Athens that to mention a woman's name in a public space is to cast aspersions on her character and her respectability. Whether that ideal was borne out in real life is a completely different question. When we look at, for example, Athenian comedy, there is an assumption made that women will have friends throughout the city, that they will be kind of socializing and going on errands. That's, again, not necessarily reflective of reality, but we might imagine that the truth for the vast majority of women at least lay somewhere in the middle. Of course, not leaving the house is also a privilege of the upper classes. If you are a very wealthy woman who has, for example, slaves to go and collect the water from the well or go and make purchases for you, that's fine. You maybe can stay at home if that is something that is expected of you. But if you are a poorer woman who has to undertake those errands herself, or who has to potentially leave the house to work, you're not going to have that same dubious privilege. So, next question. Did Greek women wear togas? So the toga is actually a Roman form of dress, and it is associated primarily with Roman men, although interestingly, it's also allegedly sometimes worn by prostitutes and adulteresses in Rome. But it's actually not a form of dress that appears in the Greek world at all. Instead, Greek women would have been wearing a type of kind of draped dress, and there are lots of different types that are worn in different parts of Greece. And then they would also wear a kind of cloak, and very often when they left the house, they would be expected to be veiled. It was a sign of your modesty and your respectability. Did Greek women wear makeup? Yes, they did. And we know this from both the literary sources and from the archaeology. So we have found small little Greek pots with the remnants of types of makeup inside. So for example, there's white lead that women seem to have been using for their complexions, and then ochre, which they seem to have been using as a sort of blush. It's really interesting how makeup is treated in the literary sources. It's often men kind of railing against women, you know, wearing all this makeup, like they look so much better natural, how could they do this to themselves? And there is also an association of makeup with potentially courtesans, or with older women who are still trying to hang on to a sexual desirability. That's a kind of classic joke in Greek comedy. Next question, could Greek women go to the theatre? Again, this is a point of endless scholarly debate. Whenever Greek sources talk about the audience at the theatre, they refer to them as men. But that's not necessarily conclusive evidence that women weren't also involved. It could also just be a convention that when there's a mixed group, you talk to them as men. So in Athens, the activity of going to the theatre is seen as a moment of kind of political communal bonding. And if that's the aim, obviously it's going to be men who are really intended to be going, because that is the political community. And a lot of these events are kind of civic religious events. That's when plays are generally performed. So we might expect that performances would have been made mainly to an audience of men, but we can't say so for certain. So did men play women in the theatre? Yes, they absolutely did. Women would not have been on the Greek stage. That's not such a problem because all the actors in a Greek play would have been wearing masks and costumes. So it was easy for them to take on those roles. Next question. What age did Greek women marry? This is such an interesting question because a lot of Greek writers discuss it and debate what the kind of correct age for a woman to enter into marriage is. It seems likely that among aristocratic women in particular, the age of marriage is essentially around puberty. So kind of 12, 13, 14. A lot of writers disagree with that. So There are certain philosophers who argue that women should marry around 18 or around 20 when they're more mature, they're more developed morally. There's actually a group of doctors who argue that women should be marrying earlier, before puberty, because they think that it's actually dangerous for a woman who has reached puberty not to be having sex, that it can cause her to go mad. So they think it's better to get it out of the way before that. Next question. Could Greek women choose their husbands? So certainly in Athens, the marriage is a contract almost entirely between the two men. So between the father and the husband. Also, if women are marrying very young, they're kind of in their early teens, their ability to push back against familial pressure in that sense is going to be very limited. There are some areas of Greece where it does seem, particularly at some periods of time, that if a woman had been married and had, divorced, or her husband had died and she was a little older, she had maybe some resources of her own, she had more control over choosing her later husbands, not at Athens, but in places like Sparta and in some of the Hellenistic kingdoms. For example, we have a lot of marriage contracts from Hellenistic Egypt, which is like Greek-ruled Egypt, where it is much more kind of framed as a contract between man and woman rather than a contract between husband and father. Next question. Could Greek women divorce? Yes. Almost universally throughout the ancient world, divorce is a completely accepted event. Both parties can initiate it. It's very easy to initiate. It's just that the husband will send the wife from the house, or the wife will leave the house and usually return to the house of her father. Those are the laws, but it does seem probably more likely that in general, divorce was something that was initiated, particularly at Athens, more by the husband than by the wife. Certainly that's what our evidence would suggest. But it's not something that seems to carry huge social stigma. Next question. What age do Greek women have children? Marriage in the Greek world really is for the purposes of procreation. That is written into the marriage contracts. And so as soon as you're married, you probably would have been expected to start having children. And of course, the forms of birth control are not very reliable. So again, it would have been potentially hard to prevent, even if you'd wanted to. So women would probably have been starting to have children in their teens and keeping having children until they reached the end of childbearing age. Next question. Did Greek women breastfeed? Some of them did. There is also a culture where elite women will send their children out to wet nurses. And there are debates among the doctors, particularly over whether that's a healthy thing to do, and whether that's good for mother and baby. But yeah, breastfeeding was practiced by some mothers. It was sometimes outsourced to poorer women. Could Greek women own property? This is a question that is going to receive wildly different answers depending on where you are in Greece, when you're asking it. So in Athens, women absolutely cannot own property. All their property is essentially controlled by their husband or their father. They can't even undertake transactions that are worth more than essentially the amount of barley that you need to feed a family for 6 days. So really they are incredibly limited in their financial abilities. That's not true at Sparta. Women can own property. They can dispose of it generally how they want to. The Athenians estimate that about 2/5 of all of Spartan property is owned by women, and a lot of Spartan women become very wealthy and use that wealth either to get involved in politics or, like Kyniska, who won at the Olympic Games, to kind of fund their own interests. So for her it was chariot racing, which was a famously expensive pursuit. Women also seem to have been able to own property in lots of other smaller Greek city-states. So there's a place called Gortyn that we have an incredibly well-preserved legal code from. Women can own property there. They can own property suddenly in, say, Hellenistic Egypt, and we have lots of contracts where women are, engaging in economic activity from there. Next question. Could Greek women inherit? Again, just like property, this is going to depend where you are. Spartan women can inherit. They can in Gortyn, they can in a lot of the Hellenistic kingdoms. They absolutely cannot in Athens. So in Athens, you have this really horrible situation where the woman can be essentially a conduit of property, but she cannot own it in her own right. So if a man dies and his only child is a daughter, she becomes an heiress, but she cannot accept that bequest in her own right. So there is a legal situation where she is forcibly married off to her closest paternal male relative, usually an uncle, in order to ensure that that inheritance remains within her father's family. Next question. Could Greek women be queens? Again, it absolutely depends on what part of Greece you're in. There are some areas of Greece that are run as monarchies, particularly after the rise of Alexander the Great. He is followed by these kind of big Hellenistic monarchies that are ruling really large areas. And women in those societies very often become incredibly powerful, either as the wives or the mothers of the kings. And we have lots of stories about their political influence, their political machinations, sometimes their political murders, or them, for example, taking power during a regency while their husband or their son is away fighting. So you might have heard, for example, of Queen Gorgo in Sparta, who is said to have had a huge influence on Leonidas, to have kind of ruled in his stead when he was away fighting. You might also have heard of Olympias, who is the mother of Alexander the Great. And when Alexander leaves to go on his campaigns, there is this kind of power struggle between Olympias and the regent that Alexander has left behind. And she, in quite a few situations, does seem to come out on top. So, did Greek women fight in wars? Generally, no. Fighting was intended to be the domain of men. But that sort of breaks down when you get to a situation where a city, for example, is under siege. There are certain stories in Greek history of women fighting to protect their homes and their families. And there are also obviously myths about female fighters. So you might have heard of the Amazons, who were believed to be this legendary race of women who, it was like an all-female society, and they were incredibly good fighters. They were the daughters of the god of war Ares, and they used these kind of double-edged battle axes and were incredibly feared in Greek mythology. It's possible that those were actually based on some reports of real women who were living in Scythia on the kind of Russian steppes, and who were potentially much more involved in fighting and in horsemanship than most of the women in Greece were. Could Greek women read? This is a very hard question to assess. It's famously hard to assess literacy rates in the ancient world in general, and we have a lot less evidence for women's education than we do for men, because obviously treaties are written on how you're meant to educate boys. There's much less concern about how you educate girls because they're not meant to be taking a public role in the life of the city-state. That being said, there is evidence that some women could read. It would probably have been down to the discretion of the family, how much they wanted to educate their daughters, whether it was going to be simply kind of for domestic duties, or whether they would also be educating them in more literary pursuits. Also, if you're going to be running a big and a rich household, it's going to be very useful for you to be able to read and write, just simply for kind of things like practical things like making accounts, shopping lists even. And then when we move into later periods of Greek history, we get much more evidence of women being able to write. We have a number of female poets. We've mentioned Sappho. There's a woman called Corina. There are a number of female Hellenistic epigrammists. And so those women suddenly were able to read and write and participate in that literary culture. Next question, did Greek women have an education? We kind of discussed this when we were talking about reading, but Greek women suddenly, all of them would have been educated in the management of a household. And there are certain texts that argue that the management of a household should be treated like a science. There are also philosophical schools that argue that women should be given a proper philosophical education, and they usually justify that by saying that it is going to make them more moral, make them better wives. But they're still advocating for, really kind of serious education for women. We also have evidence for certain women being educated for particular jobs. Suddenly, when we get down into the later Greek period, we have a lot of inscriptions talking about female doctors. Very often they had been the daughters of doctors and they were trained in their father's craft. And we even have inscriptions from city-states that are honoring these women for the kind of exceptional knowledge that they have in the medical arts. Next question, did Greek women have jobs? So we've just talked about Greek doctors. Those would probably have been at the higher end of the kind of jobs you could be doing as a woman. Most female jobs would probably have been, to some extent, an extension of female work within the house. So there would have been women who were wet nurses, women who would have taken in laundry. There's a lot of evidence for women making money and actually being incredibly economically valuable as weavers and kind of dyers of cloth. That's seen as being a real kind of domain and art form for women, and all women would have been taught to weave. Also, in places where women can own property, they could have managed those estates. So yeah, there is evidence of women working and being very economically independent. Next question, what did Greek women do in their spare time? This is a hard question to answer, and it's not one that we have a huge amount of information about, particularly because all of our written sources come generally from men. The joke in Greek comedy is that all women like doing is gossiping, talking about sex. There's no reason to believe that they didn't enjoy doing that, but there would have been other activities open to them too. So weaving was seen not just as a job, but also as kind of a real art form. Other women obviously wrote or read poetry or sung. We have images on Greek pots of women kind of reading scrolls or playing the lyre. So it's possible they were doing all of that. Women would also have been very involved in religion, and that's actually one space where women have a very legitimate and acknowledged role in the civic life of their cities. And a lot of those religious duties would have been quite enjoyable in a lot of ways. Women would have been involved in the planning of these big festivals, and they would have then, enjoyed those festivals. Some of them were all female. They involved feasting, they involved dancing, they involved kind of unknown rituals that the men weren't allowed to be party to. And so I think that would also have been a space for women to express themselves and to have fun in certain aspects. Next question, did Greek women compete in the Olympics? So the Olympics is, the competitors are all men. But there are certain Greek women who win Olympic prizes. And the way they do it is that they own and train chariot teams. And so for the chariot racing, the Olympic prize goes not to the charioteer, but to the trainer of the horses, because that is seen to be where the majority of the work and the skill goes into the win. And so there are a number of women who win in this space. So the first one we've mentioned is Kyniska, who is the Spartan princess. She wins the Olympic victory, and she sets up this incredible monument to herself in the middle of Olympia. It's a statue of her chariot, the horses, it's a statue of herself, and it's this inscription saying, I'm Kyniska, I'm a Spartan princess, I am the first woman ever to win a victory here. There are also athletic contests that are only for women. So there is a race called the Heraia, which is in honor of Hera, and all the runners in that would have been women. Did Greek women drink wine? Again, I think you're going to see here probably quite a big distinction between what is the ideal and what is the reality. Respectable women in Greece, certainly in Athens, are not meant to be drinking wine. The Athenian Symposium, which is the sort of famous Athenian drinking party, is not open to respectable women at all. The guests are going to be all men and then hetairae, who are courtesans. That does not mean that all respectable women were not drinking wine in other situations. A lot of jokes in Greek comedy center on women loving wine. Also, one of my favorite Greek pots ever shows a woman who has kind of gone to the store cupboard in her house to get some kind of domestic things, and she is taking a big swig of the kind of jug of wine on her way back. Next question. Did Greek priestesses do drugs? I think where this comes from is there is this oracle at Delphi, and she is a priestess who is said to give kind of oracular prophecies straight from the god Apollo. And there is a theory that the way in which she got into the trance-like state in which she would give her prophecies is because she would sit on top of this crack in the earth that gave off essentially psychedelic fumes. And so she'd be incredibly high, and then she would give these riddle-like prophecies that people would then have to interpret. And they very often interpreted them badly, and it led to historical disaster. That, I think, has been generally disproven. Sadly, I wish it were true. I'm really glad that we have brought up oracles, though, because they play an incredibly important role in Greek history. They would have been consulted before any major event, a war, a change in regime. And it's really interesting that you get these kind of men being sent from all over Greece to consult this woman who is sitting in a temple giving oracular responses. Especially at Delphi, that woman was not an elite priestess. She was actually chosen from among the kind of normal people of the town. Next question. Were there any Greek gender equality movements? The concept of gender equality was just not something really that existed in the Greek world. We suddenly have instances of women fighting for their own place in society, but that tends to be quite a personal endeavor. So for example, Olympias fighting for her kind of ability to rule over Macedonia. There's no sense that she is doing that on behalf of women more generally. There are certain philosophers who argue for much more female equality, but they are really seen as being, you know, quite niche. They are not in the mainstream of the discourse about gender in Greece. We do also see Greek gender roles being questioned to some extent on the Greek stage. So there are tragic heroines who kind of bemoan their fate as a woman and argue that they should have had more agency. And there are lots of comedies based around the idea of women taking over control of the state. So there is Lysistrata, which is written by Aristophanes, and he also writes a play called Assembly Women. And both of them are predicated on the idea that women are taking control of politics. And characters in those plays make arguments for women having more say in the running of the state. But ultimately, they are placed within a comedic context. And the idea is always, in the end, that this is a kind of interesting thing to watch because it is so ridiculous. That's it. That's it.
Sit down on the table.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense. If he lived, he wouldn't have lived. He would have drank himself to death at some point, as he did. And especially Achilles, I always think is like, we shouldn't look up to this guy. He's a terrible, terrible person. Like Hades famously is basically just a manager of the underworld.
Hello, I'm Tristan Hughes. I'm the host of the Ancients podcast, and I'm delighted to be rejoined by the one and only, the legend, Dr. Roel Konijnendijk. Roel, how are you doing?
Doing great.
Well, good. Okay, very laconic in your answer there. Straight away. Didn't give me much time to breathe. We're back in person to do, well, we're the guinea pigs, really, for a new format, which is agree to disagree. Am I right there? Agree to disagree? Yes, that's it. They're nodding. Kind of makes sense with strongly agree to strongly disagree.
Right, see if we can do that.
Well, it's regarding ancient Greece, and we've got here a selection of questions for it. Don't really know what's coming up, but I think it's going to be, they really want the gut reactions. So let's see what we got. Oxford academic versus someone who just interviews people about ancient history day in, day out. So, all right, you ready?
Let's go, let's do it.
Okay, I'll pick the first one. The Trojan War actually happened.
Oh, disagree. Can I put this here? I don't know if this... Can we do strongly disagree or strongly disagree?
I'm only going to put disagree actually, because I think there's a way that you can...
There is, of course. I mean, there's the contemporary material from the Bronze Age that suggests that there was a conflict. You know, okay, so the Greeks went over the sea, sure. They had some interaction with the region, possibly there was some raiding. There may even have been a war. But this isn't the Trojan War as we know it. Like, we have no reason to believe that events happened the way they happened, that there was a 10-year siege, that there were specific figures involved. I mean, all of that stuff. The only person that we know who might have been involved is this figure called Alexander, who appears in some Hittite texts, who's Paris. That's it. And so, you know, you can say that there may have been conflicts between the Achaeans and the Trojans roughly in the period of the Bronze Age, but that has nothing to do with the story that we know. That's a completely separate thing.
Look, I understand your strength of disagreement for that question, but playing devil's advocate is yes, of course, when you go to the particular characters, almost certainly didn't exist, or, you know, very different who they were, apart from this Alexander figure from Hittite texts. But for the context, historical context, there's evidence of contact between mainland Greece and what is today Western Turkey. I was talking to Dr. Emily Hauser a few weeks ago, and we were talking about Cassandra, but also this idea in Hittite records, there's this idea of princesses, but also being like kind of priestesses at the same time, so there's that tradition, and of people being taken back to Greece from Western Turkey and being in like the Mycenaean palace, almost as kind of political prisoners, I guess, something like that. So they are brought back. So there is like historical context for some of the stories that are associated with the Trojan War, and archaeologically, if the site of Hisarlik in Turkey, which is recognised to be Troy, was Troy, there seems to be archaeological evidence that there was, you know, Troy was violently destroyed around that time. So I do think there would have been Trojan Wars, not but not the Trojan War.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the distinction. So it's a lot of scholars say that there is a historical Trojan War. There's a Trojan War. Maybe there have been Trojan Wars, but that's quite different from saying, Helen was abducted and therefore, the Atreides went and gathered all the Greeks. I mean, that is a very specific narrative, which is a story, and we can obviously the Greeks retold and reshaped that story over time, and we don't need to see a historical truth in that.
Can we say a story loosely based on a historical base from hundreds of years earlier?
But we can't prove it, right?
Yeah.
It's more like, okay, there are plausible reasons to think that this may have some grounding in whatever, but there's no memory of it, right? And this is the important thing that we always stress, right? Whoever composed the poems, the figure we call Homer, didn't know there was a Bronze Age, right? There is no understanding of Mycenaean society or politics or this palatial culture, the material culture, he doesn't know it.
Are you sure? Would there be the thing about the collapse of the Bronze Age and knowing that, from hundreds of years
that isn't the story, right? Like there's a city being destroyed and then everybody goes home, with the prize that they wanted. So unless you want to argue that this is a reflection of Mycenaean raiding culture, which is, possibly some kind of memory, but it's much more likely that they're describing something they recognize, because that's how you keep a story alive, right? You make it fit your contemporary understanding. So that's what we're looking at. It's a story about the early Archaic period, which has some traces of an oral tradition that goes much further back. Sure, I mean, it has that.
I'm glad we differed straight away, but I must admit I had that little bit of caution there.
No, of course. I mean, it's fair enough. I mean, some people are persuaded. Some people believe this is enough, right? But that's the question. Do you think that or not? So
all right.
Move these back?
Yeah, move it back. That's not needed anymore.
Oh, is that how it goes? Yeah, excellent. Look forward to that.
Let's do it, man.
The Spartans were the best warriors in the ancient world.
Ancient world.
In the ancient world is what it says. I mean, we're gonna. Is
you
there another?
Sit down on the table.
Exactly.
No, we don't want to break the fourth wall too much there, do we? But it's the ancient world. I mean, wow.
That is a broad. That's a bold claim,
isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there were for some time perhaps the greatest warriors in the Peloponnese, which you could probably argue, although our guys might disagree. But no, there's obviously. I don't think anyone could seriously claim that they were, more successful or better trained or better equipped than some of the great, professional world-conquering armies of that period: Persians, Macedonians, Romans, Carthaginians. Even you have all sorts of people who could have claim to a better record of victories, or just generally taking war more seriously than a militia of leisured landowners who did some training every now and then to affirm their state.
But it's important to kind of clear the myth from the reality, isn't it? That, I mean, the Spartans, there was a lot of training, and mental resilience was a big thing when they're growing up, but it's not weapons training, they're not a professional army, which is sometimes the thoughts that people have when they think of ancient Sparta.
That's right. And so, I mean, you have to imagine these Spartans are still a militia, just like the militias of all the other Greek states, but they take pride in setting aside, they have all their time available to be citizens, to be contributing members of their community, right? That's how they have, they maintain the society with a slave underclass that lets them live a life of leisure, and they are supposed to devote that life to good service to the state. And that is both in council and in war and in other ways. They try to be the best citizens they can be. And obviously part of that is that they can devote themselves to some physical exercise, and that in wartime they seem to have done some training in the classical period. But that is, I'm always drawing on this cliche of, the one-eyed man, land of the blind. That is the Spartans. I mean, they have the advantage. And Aristotle says exactly this. He says, they had the advantage because they trained and all the others didn't. But when the others started to train, the advantage evaporated immediately.
And it's interesting, just ancient world, so broad. I mean, Spartan warrior against a Roman legionary, I think it's, Roman legionary wins that. It says it's professional army.
I mean, the Spartans very cleverly became good friends of the Romans as soon as they could.
I think we are going to agree on that one, strongly disagree. So, but yes. So I guess we'll move on to that. And you dispose that card however you want. Okay.
Go on.
Don't hurt the cameraman at the same time. This is an interesting one. Athens was a democracy.
I mean, Athens was a democracy. You have to. Strongly
agree. Strongly agree.
I mean, there's an important caveat. So, okay, fine, we'll take.
No, well,
strongly agree in the literal sense that the word demokratia was invented to describe the Athenian system. Yes. So you can obviously say words don't mean what they mean, but if you can say democracy exists as a concept, it exists because the Athenians had a very developed political system that they called democracy.
But if we're saying that democracy then is the same as today, it's completely different.
Completely different, yeah. So it's a very different system. It built on very different values, different ideology. Obviously in Athens, you have a system in which all freeborn male citizens have equal rights to have access to power, same voting rights, the same position before the law.
Is it over 30 or over 18? I can't remember.
Over 18.
It's over 18, okay.
When you get 30, you can be general. There are a couple of things that are released based on status and age. But generally, you all have the same rights, and that is what democracy means. There is no property requirement, right? But no Greek state ever contemplated giving the same rights to women. Yes. That just isn't a thing in Athenian democracy ever. And also, it's a slave state. It's a slave society. They have huge numbers of enslaved people doing all sorts of terrible things for them. And it's been argued even that the reason they can be a democracy, have this democratic ideology that they're all equals, is because the worst jobs, the most menial work, the most demeaning and horrible and risky work, like for instance working the silver mines, was done by enslaved people. So no one had to say, yeah, okay, we're all equals, but I work in the mines and you own a big estate and race horses all day. Actually, there is this sort of baseline that Athenian citizens didn't have to do that kind of work, and that lets them think that they're all equal.
But they love it also by saying like, oh, but we were the rowers in the fleet, right? Which is also seen as a really hard physical job, but it's not being.
But it's not demeaning, right? That's the thing. It's not gonna kill you unless you're unless you're in battle.
The only other reason that I say agree is because with Alexander the Great and what happens next, it's not always a democracy. In ancient history, there are many times when actually it's run by an oligarchy, especially after the time of Alexander the Great, when you have these various Macedonian generals and leaders vying for power in the Greek mainland, including Athens. Sometimes they install, either they have a garrison in the city near the Piraeus, or they have an oligarchy which is more favourable to Macedonian overlordship, more so than democracy. Democracy is normally seen, especially after Alexander the Great's death, with the people who want to be free of Macedonian control. But when you've got a bigger power in the area, and Athens is just a city-state, sometimes their democracy is taken away, or it is very much censored, maybe the way it's bits are taken out of it. The more troublesome bits of the Athenian democracy are removed, so that they're easier to control. So it's like they say, hey, it's democracy, but it's not really. It's the Macedonians or whoever.
It's a democracy we leave to the rich to manage, which is essentially what happens in the Hellenistic period.
So that's why I say agree, but I get what you mean with strongly agree, but as you say, very different to today. Okay.
All right.
Yes, so we go back to the next one.
Let's see. Okay. Achilles would beat Hercules in a fight.
God.
Hercules is a god, though. It's a difficult one.
Demigod. And Hercules would beat Achilles.
No, it says Achilles would beat Hercules.
I'd probably say disagree.
I'd probably say disagree as well. Can we just disagree on something?
I think
we're too aligned here. This is a problem. Should I pick Achilles here?
It's just
it's going to be a lot faster than this big guy with his glove.
He's got the Achilles heel, right? So they just.
There is an interesting thing in the play Hercules or Mad, where there becomes this debate between the archer. Obviously, Hercules is an archer as well, right? Yeah. Hercules is famously a club and arrow man, who's very much the sort of warrior archetype of the Near East. And the hoplite, who has his own strengths, in the battle line, he's protected, but he can't run away from a fight, so he's always got to take the risk. And that is very much almost an Achilles versus Heracles matchup. But obviously Heracles wins, so it doesn't it doesn't really affect things. The problem is always the Greeks don't seem to be too interested in the idea of how is Achilles going to beat his enemies. They don't necessarily want to know how Achilles, he just is, right? So when he goes nuts and decides to go and murder lots of Trojans, that's what he does. Yeah. And there isn't a particular way in which he does that. There isn't a particular strength that he has. He's fast, essentially, when he throws a javelin.
Swift-footed Achilles.
Exactly, right? That's it. And when he throws a javelin, Athena points in the right direction. Whereas when someone throws a javelin at him, Athena makes it sort of go away.
No, he doesn't wrestle like a monster, a lion, with his bare hands, right? And then makes that lion skin his...
No, gotta concede that. He also isn't the stable boy in his own time.
No, it's... I've never thought of the question between who would win between Heracles and Achilles.
It's not a question that I think the Greeks would ask.
No.
It's not something. These are both figures that are very, very sort of emblematic of what it is to be a warrior. But Achilles is a hero from a story, whereas Heracles is the hero you invoke when you need some help.
Yes.
And in that sense, I think, I would say, we disagree, because if you're a Greek and you're on the battlefield, you call on Heracles, you say, you are the warrior who will stand by my side. You'd never call on Achilles.
Well, it's like Alexander the Great. He will go to Achilles' tomb, and pay homage to him. And, reads the Iliad, so he knows about Achilles and wants to emulate that kind of warrior style. But he's looking at the legendary achievements of Heracles, maybe like going all the way to India and stuff like that. So it is very much, kind of on the next level, I would argue. So I think we agree there, don't we? Agree to disagree. Okay, next one.
We're going to move this back.
Yeah, got to move that. What a funny one. Greek architecture would have looked tacky.
To whom?
That's in the eye of the beholder. I'll strongly disagree for that one. It's just,
tacky. Yeah, no, that's.
It's like, I mean, it depends what architecture you're talking about. Are you talking about an everyday house? That maybe it wouldn't have been like. It's not going to be the most architecturally.
Yeah, we're talking about the paint, aren't we? We're talking about the gaudy paint. Because obviously we imagine that Greek. I'm going to go
Okay.
Because we imagine these Greek temples being this pristine marble, shiny white.
True,
that's the kind of thing. But actually, in practice, a lot of them contain traces of pigment that suggest they would have been brightly painted.
Yeah.
And some experiments, some attempts to try and reconstruct that. For instance, there is this beautiful reconstructions of the sculpture of the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina. And they look gaudy, they look terrible. And so the question is always like, is it because we don't quite get how they would have done it? Or is it because they didn't actually care? They liked these sort of bright colors and sort of fairly simplistic images that look to us like, not the kind of sophistication that we would expect of
Yeah,
Greek
I don't think ancient Greeks would have thought it tacky. I get what you mean about the color and all about it, but just the architectural scale of those massive temples and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You look at the Parthenon, like kind of the details of that, whether it's the what's it, the ellipsis? Is the ellipsis like, or like the idea that the columns bulge a little bit in the middle.
Yeah, so that they look like...
So they look completely straight. And then like the metopes and the pediments and all of that stuff and the sculpture, even with some paint on it, like I don't think they would have thought it out of the ordinary because that's what they were used to.
Yeah. No, they wouldn't have thought it was tacky. They wouldn't have done it otherwise.
Exactly.
The question is, like, if we saw them in their ancient glory, would we think they were tacky? And I think... Possibly, yeah. Because our tastes are obviously terribly unrefined. We don't see things the way the Greeks do.
It's even when looking at like the Augustus Prima Porta, that Roman statue, right?
Really ugly.
That reconstruction, and it's just got like the red hair and the big lips and all that stuff.
And it's all just blue and red, right? Those are the only colours on there. And I can't imagine that that's how it would have looked. I really don't. There's something missing in the way we reconstruct it.
I think you're right.
But it's very hard to say what it would be.
And also sometimes I think it is
because we do know that Greek painting was very highly developed, right? Supposedly they were able to do things that looked so real. I mean, there's this famous story of a painting contest where somebody painted some grapes and then a bird came at them to try and peck them.
Yes.
And this is the kind of level of realism they supposedly were able to achieve. Well, if that's possible, we can't imagine that they just had these fairly childish, like single sort of matte colors. I think there must have been something else that we can't trace on the pigment, but that must have been there to beautify it.
I think that also makes sense, of course, with the sculptures like the polykleitos, when it's the realism time, and they're trying to make the human body look as realistic as possible, and you don't throw that away by really, really tacky painting and stuff. But okay, a bit of a disagreement there. So
fair enough.
Yes.
What's next? Zeus was more evil than Hades.
If you watch Chaos, on Netflix, you'd agree on that.
Jeff Goldblum just loves it. I mean, more evil? I don't have an opinion on this, but
I don't really have an opinion on it.
I mean, I would. Okay, so let's say, like, what do they actually do in the story? Like, Hades famously is basically just a manager of the underworld, and he's like,
I was leaning towards an agree that
in Chaos and in many other shows. I mean, he's basically just an overworked bureaucrat who's like, oh, why are you sending me all these people? Although the story is like, okay, his domain is going to keep growing, whereas on the surface, everything's going to stay the same.
I think Zeus is definitely an architect of more destructive or infamous stories that have survived from mythology. But I mean, Hades, I guess you don't hear as much about him, as you say, because he's just in the underworld.
He's just chilling. Well, he does also do his fair share of,
abducting Persephone,
abducting and raping. Yeah. So there's definitely, he's not innocent. No. None of them are, right?
But I feel Zeus is almost the next level, isn't he, kind of thing.
I mean, because he's notorious, proverbial, right? It's just this sense of like, whatever he sees, he goes and takes it. And that is because Zeus personifies, in a way, the sort of ultimate male authority in the Greek mind. Like, he is the patriarch, and so he does whatever he wants because he has no one telling him he can't. He has no accountability. And that works for well and for ill. You know, ultimately, everybody can petition Zeus, and sometimes he is generous and kind, and sometimes he'll sort things out for you because he's stronger than anyone else. In a physical sense in the Iliad, like, he is stronger, like, none of you could stop me, as this boast about, like, he's physically stronger than anything else in the world. And that could work in your favor, but it also means no one can stop him doing whatever he wants.
Is it interesting to think, I'm thinking of Athenian comedy now, is Aristophanes' frogs, when they go to the underworld and they meet with Hades.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they evidently think that they can show Hades in comedy and laugh at it as well. I can't think of any, please correct me if I'm wrong, I can't think of any plays where Zeus is like a big figure. Maybe that's also kind of like an underlying thing as well, but that's just me having like thinking on the spot at the moment. But I think regardless, yeah.
Zeus has many faces. I mean, we do have to remember that Zeus also gets invoked a lot as a protector.
Yes.
He's a Zeus of oaths, he's Zeus of messengers, like he has a lot of functions that make him so very important. And it gets, you know, people do rely on him and call on him for help. So in that sense, you know, he's not considered a force of evil like Ares.
But he's scary. Yeah, you
but
want
he's scary.
on his
You know,
side, exactly.
He's the sort of the archetype, sort of a dad you fear even if you look up to him.
Yes.
This kind of figure. Yeah, that is very much what they're going for as well.
No, I agree. I think you might have been right, strongly agree, but we'll have a bit of difference there.
Is that evil? That's the question.
Yes,
I mean, does that mean evil?
Define evil. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Good point. Oh, interesting one. Odysseus is the greatest Greek hero. So I'll put this.
The greatest Greek hero. What does that mean?
I know, it's because it's superlatives, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, you know, for an average person, and I don't do much on Greek mythology. I love doing interviews on it, but my main area is actually learning about the real Greek, historical Greek figures, whether that's Phocion or Alexander the Great or many, many others. I can see why some people would have Odysseus as their favourites. I think the Odyssey is like it's more popular than the Iliad for many centuries until relatively recently. And of course there's a new Odyssey film coming out, and it's full of stories, you know, fighting monsters. He's cunning, Trojan War. Does get all of his men killed, you know.
But then he kills all the suitors. Is that good?
After he'd been gone for 20 years.
Still got it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story. I personally have a softer spot, I told you before recording this, for a lesser known Greek hero of the Trojan War called Diomedes, or you say Diomedes, don't you?
Yeah.
But he's lesser known, but he is kind of like Odysseus, but better in a way, I'd say.
It's the weird thing, but in the Iliad you obviously get loads of heroes that are really famous, Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, and they all have their strengths, and they all have their moments of greatness, they all have their feats of heroism, but they all have flaws, they have very flawed figures, and especially Achilles, I always think, is like, we shouldn't look up to this guy, he's a terrible, terrible person throughout. But Diomedes is the one who sort of is the paragon of what a hero should be. He does nothing wrong. Everywhere he goes, he wins every fight. He wounds several gods in battle. You know, he overcomes anyone who gets sent against him, and he doesn't seem to have any flaws. Like he's not in any sense.
Apparently, his wife cheats on him, and he can't rule the city when he goes back home. But that's it. Yeah,
no good deed goes unpunished.
No, that's right.
But yeah, there you go. But you know, there are so many heroes, and the thing I always feel about these stories is, you know, it's not for me to decide who is and isn't a good person. These are stories. You need to decide for yourself which one you find appealing, relatable, interesting, and that can be that should depend on you.
Absolutely, and hashtag justice for Diomedes. But like at the same time, and also there's so many different versions of many of these stories and myths, and we haven't even mentioned names like Theseus, Heracles, Perseus.
Bellerophon.
Bellerophon, I don't want to get to him about Theseus either. He's a not a good person, but as you say, eye of the beholder, depending on what you think. But I think for both of us, we don't think Odysseus is the greatest, but that's personal opinion.
Yeah, exactly. That's just us saying, there's so much out there, and you gotta go and read these stories and enjoy them and see what you think.
Very true. Okay, I guess go for the next one. Whoop. Just because I saw one of our crew literally right there, I was going to do it that way, and I thought
hit them in the eye,
hit the
got
camera
sharp
on the
corners,
eye, and then that would be HR. Yeah, exactly.
Tristan is the greatest of the heroes. Yeah. Alexander the Great would have conquered all of Asia if he lived.
I'm sorry. I love Alexander the Great. I think his story is amazing. Sorry, you do yours
If
first.
he lived, I'm probably going to go and agree with that. It's just one of those things that it doesn't make sense. If he lived, he wouldn't have lived. He would have drank himself to death at some point, as he did. or finally caught that javelin to the face like all his predecessors.
The reason why I disagree, and I think Alexander the Great is an extraordinary figure, is because by the time he gets to the Hyphasis River, like in Pakistan, Indian subcontinent, like one of the things is that they expressly hear that there's huge armies waiting for him in eastern India, in the Ganges area. And when you think about his previous battle with Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, which when you take a step back, Porus has got a kingdom the size of what is Macedonia, what is northern Greece today. Alexander has got an empire stretching from mainland Greece to Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush, and he's got an army of over 100,000 men. Porus has nowhere near that amount. And yet the sources always portray this as one of his greatest tests. Fighting elephants. It's a very
huge numbers
different
of cavalry, chariots.
But Porus is just one king. And there is the stories of like those armies beyond the Hyphasis, and what he would have to face. The Macedonians are getting more and more, are struggling more and more. Things that would Alexander then return? It feels
That's
like
true. That's
it feels
true.
Like when he goes back to Babylon, if he'd have survived even longer, I don't think he's got any more designs of going even further east.
His designs are going against the Arabians, the
Arabia,
Carthaginians, whatever.
Athens as well.
Obviously, conquer all of Asia. What does that mean? Like, who is he going to encounter? The states further to the south and east, if you go into India and further into China, obviously are much larger, more organized than the kind of states that you might find going west. At the same time, the reason I'm sort of putting this here on agree is obviously you can't say anything about what would have happened, but you do see that everywhere Alexander goes, he's meeting different kinds of enemies, and he is just showing himself to be constantly very adaptable. And he is able to use the kind of different elements of his army, which at this point are extremely highly experienced and trained and work extremely well together. He's able to rely on them to find different solutions to the problems that he encounters. So he does fight, he fights Thracians, he fights Greeks, he fights Persians, he fights, Scythians, he fights Indians, all with equal sort of unmatched success. And so, I mean, there's always lots of talk about, the tactical genius of Alexander. A lot of this really boils down much more on his level of dependence, like his ability to just rely on his troops to pull it off if he just uses them in the right ways. But he is sort of able to do that, to solve the problems that he encounters. And I don't see any particular reason why that should stop.
It's a good point. It's a very good point. And I think of like the rock fortresses that he has to take, like in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan area. But at the same time, those years when he was in the northeast, fighting against the Sogdians, largely the Sogdians and the Scythians that you mentioned as well. I mean, that's the hardest of his whole career. They lose so many troops, and it's like kind of the logistics thing as well. Yeah, it's an interesting story, and I can see why. I mean, there's strong arguments there that kind of ability to adapt to fight these different enemies, which he does so well. It is a hypothetical at the same time, isn't it, about what would have happened if he'd gone east? Would he have been able to ally with other kings like he had with like Taxiles?
Yeah.
When he's going down the Indus River Valley, I mean, he's still got big people to fight there, and he beats them all. Oh. It's a good point. It's a good point. I'll stick with there at the moment because I'm just not sure how much further it would go.
That's fair. I mean, it's obviously, who knows, at one point he was going to, one of these dice rolls that he kept going for would roll against him, and he would just die in battle, or he would die of disease or whatever else. And obviously I think the very important point that you made is that his army was fed up. And so at some point you could say, it doesn't matter what he wants, it doesn't matter what he's capable of. If he doesn't have that army, he can't do it. So he needs to go home at some point.
He's very good at laying also the foundations. We think of the Macedonian phalanx, we think of the Macedonians, but actually he starts, training schools start being up to teaching, whether you're in Anatolia or even if you're in Persia. In one case, interesting case, they are taught in that Macedonian style of warfare, so he can kind of replenish his troops and all that.
But the Macedonians hate it, right? That's the thing.
They hate it,
because they don't like sharing access to power. They don't like sharing their friendship with Alexander.
Yeah, because they are racist in that sense, and that was just the mindset that they were in. They thought they were superior. Yeah. Let's. You did that one, didn't you? Yeah. Let's go. Yes, go back this one. This is an interesting one. The Persians were more civilized than the Greeks.
I was just going, what does civilized mean?
No, I don't even know if I can vote on this one. I was still going to go in the disagree anyway. But I
mean, okay, we could go with disagree in the sense that the problem is, obviously both the Greeks and the Persians thought they were the most civilized people in the world, and the Romans did later on. I mean, that is what you think in the ancient world. You are the most civilized people. Obviously, if you ask them, yes, they're more civilized than the Greeks. If we look at them, they're both heinous in their own way. I mean, they might be different. But they are essentially all they hold values and find things normal that we find absolutely repulsive.
I think there's some interesting arguments, which is like, both are bad, but is the Persian Empire a bit better in how they treat their subjects, kind of thing, with the satrapies and kind of letting them kind of be, looking after them. They can, as long as they don't revolt against the king, that they'll kind of let them be and keep their traditions.
So to some extent, in terms of cultural tolerance, I mean, they're obviously very happy for people to continue living as they do, because that's how you keep them from revolting. But then you see satrapal documents of what that rule actually looks like. You have a couple of archives, it's very scattered, a bit in Bactria, a bit in Egypt, how these people actually rule. I mean, they see these places as essentially just their domain to take from whatever they want, and their whole sole purpose is to take as much as they can. So they just absolutely strip these countries bare if they can, if they can get away with it, anything they can. And they order their own underlings, their managers, their bailiffs, their supervisors, to literally grab people off the street, enslave them, make them, put them to work.
Yeah.
I mean, that is how the Persian Empire works. It's essentially just the Iranian elite enriching itself off the backs of everybody they can keep under their command. And so, to a large extent, even though they're allowed to, Egyptians are allowed to be Egyptian and Babylonians Babylonian, there is a huge amount of exploitation going on. That seems to be the sole purpose of this whole empire. So even though these people are able to build huge things like Persepolis, the palace, which are magnificent structures, and even though they're able to keep this empire together with this enormous road network, and they build all this beautiful, they spread all this beautiful material culture, are they more civilized? Or are they just they're in it for themselves? Obviously, they're able to live to a standard that the Greeks look up to, because they all want that level of luxury and wealth, but it comes at the cost of everybody else.
No, exactly. It's that money, isn't it? Which is really interesting. And also, I guess maybe we should talk really about Alexander the Great and his kind of Persianization as he goes on, kind of adopting Persian practices. But then again, that's a king's level. That is kind of seeing the benefits of Persian rule, but for the elite, and everyone has to bow down before you, which,
well, literally, physically, exactly.
Macedonians don't like. No, it's a fair point. I'm on there now. Okay, we'll go on.
All right. Is this
I think it is. Here we go.
All right, here we go. The Romans owe their success to the Greeks. Would you say?
I'd say disagree, just because obviously there is influence from the Greeks and there's a lot of contact between them. But they've also, the Romans, yes, they create their own success at the same time, and they have influence from other peoples as well. Etruscans is a big one that's always forgotten about. I do love the story of the ancient Greeks in southern Italy and their contacts with the Romans and the Etruscans. I was at the beautiful, and one of the colleagues in the room here was too. Paestum, or Paestum, you say that recently.
Posidonia,
it's ancient Greek Posidonia, and they had, it looks like they've had contact with the Etruscans and the Lucanians, and the Romans as well. So there's that interaction there, and you could look at the Romans originally having a phalanx kind of hoplite style of warfare, right? But and like a lot of Greek pottery in Italy, not just Romans, Etruscan tombs and all that. But it's not all down to the Greeks.
No, of course not. I mean, this is the kind of thing where the Romans themselves prided themselves in their ability to sort of encounter and adopt things that worked, right? So they see themselves as a very adaptable people. And that's a self-narrative. We don't necessarily have to believe that. But it's certainly true that when, for instance, Polybius goes and sets out his entire work, the purpose of his entire history is to say, how did the Romans conquer the world, right? And his answer is that they are in important ways different from the Greeks, that they organize their state better fundamentally, is that they have a better way of both managing their own affairs, balancing their own sort of internal groups, but also when they take over other peoples, of better managing conquest, being able to co-opt people, get them to co-sign to the idea of being ruled by the Romans, getting them to accept this kind of thing. So in a lot of ways, I mean, they did things that the Greeks could never have done if they kept running things the way they did. So I think in that sense, the Romans are something different in the ancient world.
It's a whole different style, isn't it, as well? With the ancient Greeks, you think of the city-state. You'll later think of kingdoms with the Hellenistic period, but then there are leagues of cities as well. With the Romans, maybe originally a city-state, but then it is just republic, empire, basically. Like an administration thing.
Yeah, and by the by the imperial period, when they extend citizenship to everyone in the empire, that is something that go and tell a Spartan that's a way to rule an empire. They'd be like, no, we keep this to ourselves. The whole purpose of the state, similar to what we're talking about with the Persians, is to favor the ruling class. Whereas the Romans seem to have a much better sense that if you include people in that, you can get buy-in, and you'll be much more stable. You'll have much more resources to draw upon, and you can keep it going.
That being said, there does seem to be like this great admiration, especially with the Roman upper echelons for ancient Greece and ancient Greek culture. I think Emperor Hadrian is a good example as well. His trips to Athens. Julius Caesar, I think, was going to go and study rhetoric or something on the island of Rhodes.
Yeah. He's often quoted in Latin, but his quotes would have been in Greek.
In Greek, exactly.
Yeah,
Greek writing, Greek language is very prevalent. The gods as well, Roman gods, you can see similar parallels with the Greek pantheon as well. Yeah. So there are clear ways that the Greeks influenced the Romans. And am I correct that the Romans don't see the Greeks as barbarians?
So, I mean, it's a different kind of barbarian, right? They have stereotypes about the Greeks. They think they're deceitful and lying, and they keep talking all the time, but they're not very good at doing anything. And obviously, there's a sense in which obviously they're associated with education and high culture, which is always a form of sort of moral corruption, right? Like the real man is a simple man who is a man of action, a man of violence.
And farming, I guess.
And farming, exactly, and straight judgment, this kind of thing. And the Greeks obviously are especially the Athenians, famous for their oratory. They can argue both ways about any question. That is a little bit sus. And I mean, even the Greeks themselves sort of agreed to this. Like they had this understanding of, which is why we use the word sophistry. It's this idea that if you are able to do this, then there's something deceitful about you. But at the same time, of course, that education is also valuable to the Romans. So they take it in, they admire it, they look up to it, they adopt it, they expand on it. A lot of these things influence them. But it's very interesting to see, for instance, in material culture, the Romans themselves told the story that they didn't really appreciate Greek art until they had sacked Syracuse during the Second Punic War. And brought all the loot to Rome.
This is Archimedes and his circles.
Exactly, yeah. And so they take all the loot from Syracuse, one of the biggest and richest Greek cities. They take it to Rome, and then they say, actually, that's quite nice. But that's after their great success, right? They first succeed, and then they become more sort of enamored of Greek culture.
They did it with Corinth as well. They just take all the riches back to Rome. And say, oh, this looks pretty great. So I think disagree is quite good for that, because it's evident influences, but you can't just say the Romans were as they were because of the Greeks.
Right.
Although, of course, Aeneas, I guess, Trojan War.
But that's much later, right? I mean, this is Virgil writing in the Augustan period and trying to say, like, we inherited something from them, which is fair enough. But that's,
fair enough. Well, I think that's it.
Right.
I think well done.
Well done.
That was
cheers.
Yeah. That was interesting. It was.
We agree too much.
It's difficult though, because I think sometimes we do kind of have a similar kind of mindset, which is critiquing, but also there are just quite a lot of superlatives in there.
Yeah.
Like the greatest Greek hero is
what
difficult to say.
Yeah.
The Alexander one though was a nice contrast to have. It's an interesting format to think of with when it comes to ancient history, because it also feels like it's the one which would have the most differences in opinion, because there's more debates of the evidence.
True, yeah.
No two archaeologists can agree on the use of the Roman pedilum javelin or something like that.
I don't want to get into one of these just on Greek warfare. It'll just be like
that'll be for another time. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe, and let us know what you thought of this, and if you'd like to see more agree to disagree formats in the future. We are the guinea pigs. We're the first two of ancient Greece, and no doubt we can look at doing more in the future. I mean,
glad to be of service. Thanks so much for having me.